Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
The first item of business is a statement by Michael Russell on next steps on Scotland's future. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call Michael Russell for 10 minutes, please. There we are, Michael Russell. We'll try again. Okay. I now call Michael Russell.
I won't be deflected as easily as that. Presiding Officer, much has happened since the First Minister set out in late April the Scottish Government's view of continued Brexit chaos and of the measures this Government must bring forward to protect the people of this country. Last Thursday, Scotland said loudly and clearly that it is a European nation and it intends to remain one. It also rejected all attempts to deflect that argument with spurious assertions about other matters and showed its contempt for equivocation. Elections can be brutal judgments on parties and politicians. This one certainly was. But, Presiding Officer, elections can also be fresh starts. So if all the parties in this chamber are willing to hear the clear voice of Scotland, then I believe we can find a way to put behind us the divisions of Brexit and move forward together. And that is what this statement is about. On the 11th of April, when the EU threw the UK a lifeline to avoid a no-deal Brexit, Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, said to Westminster, "Please don't waste this time." But he's been ignored. Not only has nothing happened to resolve the Brexit impasse, but now the stalemate looks like lasting for several more months, whilst ever more extreme Tory MPs vie with each other to present the most hardline positions to their party faithful. The Tories are heading for a no-deal Brexit, and some positively welcome that disastrous direction of travel. A Boris Johnson premiership is no longer a bad joke, it's a frightening possibility. Substitute Rubb or Lidsom or Gove or Hancock or McVeigh or any of the others for Johnson, and the situation is no better. Most are heading with pleasure to the cliff edge, but Scotland must not be forced against our will to go with them. So let me at the outset make one thing very clear to the Tories at Westminster and to the Tories in this chamber. The SNP manifesto on which we won the Holyrood election in 2016 and on which this government is founded said the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. Any deal which takes Scotland out of the EU against the wishes of the majority of people in Scotland has that effect. That is what people voted for when they voted the SNP into government. And if a new Tory Prime Minister attempts a no-deal Brexit, whilst we will do everything possible to stop it and everything we can to mitigate it, it will yet be further proof that the conditions set out in our manifesto in April 2016 have been met in full. And there will be an even greater urgency to give Scotland a choice of a different future. The Scottish Government and the SNP at Westminster will, of course, continue to do all we can to stop Brexit for the whole of the UK. In particular, we will continue to support a second referendum on EU membership, a position which received widespread support on Thursday. But time is running out. The third anniversary of the Brexit referendum will be with us in less than a month's time. The accelerating shambles has caused and is causing real damage to Scotland's economy and to our social fabric. The assumption that a UK government and a UK Parliament would or could in any way do better for Scotland than our own independent institutions has been finally and completely destroyed. Presiding Officer, there must be, and there is, a better way forward. That is, in our view, for Scotland to become an independent European nation. But as we seek that way forward, we must try and build as much consensus as we can. One thing we've learned from Brexit is this: there is a need for reconciliation and the bringing together of different views. The current Prime Minister did none of that when in office, and the baleful result is there for all to see. We must try and break the current logjam with the power of fresh ideas. To do that, we must approach our collective national future in a spirit of openness and acceptance that we all want the best for our country. We must be mindful not just of those who won, but also those who lost, not just this week, nor even in 2016, but in 2014 too. It will not be easy, but at least we start on that process with a high degree of consensus about the basic fact. The Westminster system is broken, and there is no mending of it in sight. The First Minister said last month that we must reach out and be inclusive, and our approach to the three tasks we're now taking forward has been and is just that. So firstly, as context, I can confirm that despite the chaos we witnessed in Whitehall, my colleagues and I will continue to attend intergovernmental meetings with UK and Wales, and hopefully soon Northern Ireland, counterparts. The destination the Scottish Government wishes for this country is independence. But as we travel towards that, we have a role in helping to improve the structures under which we presently live and work. In the past 2 years, I've often quoted the terms of reference to the JMC-EN. They have consistently and fundamentally been ignored by the UK Government, and that strategy was, I believe, at the express wish of the current Prime Minister, imposed upon her ministers at every level and at every turn. She had and continues to have no interest in seeing the devolved settlement observed. Now she is going, that must change. There must be a new, meaningful respect for our position and for the responsibilities which are ours as of right. There needs to be a clear and urgent timetable for the current intergovernmental review, which must secure a legal underpinning to the relationship, and the UK Government must commit to respecting the legislative consent mechanism rather than ignoring it. These matters will be discussed at the next JMC-EN due before the end of June. We must see significant progress on them if these meetings are to have any future purpose. Presiding Officer, that's about the journey. Let's now turn to the destination and the three areas of activity which the First Minister set out in her April statement. Firstly, the Referendum Scotland Bill was introduced to the Parliament yesterday and has been published this morning. This bill will, it is hoped, have completed its parliamentary progress by the end of this calendar year. As the First Minister said in April, it is the intention of the Government to offer the people of Scotland a choice on independence later in the term of this Parliament. Of course, should circumstances change, we would have the option of seeking Parliament's agreement to proceed on an accelerated timetable. The bill provides a legal framework for holding referendums on matters which are now or in future within the competence of the Scottish Parliament. The rules it sets out are of the highest standards and will ensure that results are widely and internationally accepted. It brings Scotland into line with the UK, where there is already standing legislation for referenda through the Political Parties Elections and Referendum Act, which Westminster passed in 2000. As the First Minister indicated in her statement, we intend at a future date to negotiate with the UK Government for a Section 30 order to put beyond doubt our competence to hold a referendum on independence. When the framework is used in those or in any other circumstances, a separate vote at a future date will allow members to consider the specific topic and approve the question. The proposed franchise will be based on that, used for local government and Scottish Parliament elections, which includes EU citizens and 16 and 17-year-olds. It will be updated to incorporate future extensions to the franchise. I previously set out my intention to extend the franchise for Scottish Parliament and local government elections to all people legally resident in Scotland, whatever their nationality. Those proposals will be brought forward shortly. Given the disastrous and shameful experience of many EU citizens last Thursday, it is now obvious this is the only way to secure the democratic rights of every citizen. I look forward to working with other parties at all stages of the parliamentary process. Secondly, on cross-party talks about the broken Westminster system and the future needs and direction of Scotland, I welcome the commitment from Labour and the Greens to explore what might be possible. I hope the other parties who have not yet responded will now confirm they wish to do so. I have suggested using an independent interlocutor who would talk to parties separately to gather views and create an agenda and format for the talks. This would take the pressure out of the process and allow better engagement without any hangover from past discussions. I intend to start a first round next month and to build on that if the other parties are willing. These talks are without preconditions, and I commit myself and the Scottish Government to constructive engagement in them. I know that wider Civic Scotland is keen to be involved. I will work with the parties to consider how that might be possible. Finally, Presiding Officer, we've made considerable progress with the creation of a Citizens' Assembly. 2 weeks ago, I visited Ireland, where I met some of the key people responsible for the Constitutional Convention and the Assembly. I'm meeting with a range of experts from this country and overseas in order to further inform our own planning. There's already a lot of interest in and enthusiasm for the Assembly. I hope that all parties will welcome and become involved in the initiative, as was the case in Ireland. In order to help members engage more, I've arranged for the secretaries of the Irish initiatives to come to Scotland on the 19th of June to speak to MSPs and others. This will include a briefing session to party leaders or their nominees. At and after the meetings on the 19th of June, I would want all parties to offer their thoughts and suggestions. I hope to be able to announce an independent chair and the formation of an expert steering group in the coming weeks, and to confirm the timetable and the process for formulating the precise issues for deliberation when we return in September. We intend to hold the first session of the Assembly in the autumn and have all 5 or 6 sessions completed by next spring. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, as we take forward a range of activities based upon consensus and compromise, we will be endeavouring to get away from the negativity and nastiness of the current Brexit process. Scotland deserves, and this week has clearly demanded, better. We must create a country in which we all feel we have gained something worth having, where we all feel part of a shared national endeavour, regardless of the particular side of the argument we have come from. That is the spirit which imbued the First Minister's statement in April, and which the Scottish Government is determined to carry forward. I hope we can do so together. That is the fresh start the people of Scotland have offered us. We should all grasp it with both hands.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in the statement, and I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question would press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Adam Tompkins.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Minister for early sight of his statement. In a week where new figures show that more patients than ever are waiting more than 12 weeks for treatment in Scotland's NHS, we might have expected a ministerial statement on the SNP's mishandling of the health service. But no, here we are again. Here we are again talking about Nicola Sturgeon's pet obsession with independence. And this only a few days after she said that a vote for the SNP in last week's European election was not a vote for independence. She must think our heads button up the back. Presiding Officer, there is a case for standing legislation on the conduct and campaign rules for referendums. But the bill published today goes so much further than that. Under this bill, SNP ministers will have the power to set any referendum question at any time on any matter of their choosing. Ministers, not Parliament, will set the question, pick the date and determine the campaign period. And if they change their minds, ministers, not Parliament, can then change any of these rules. This bill is not about the democracy of letting the people decide in a lawful referendum. It's about the diktat of ministers. Even the powers of the Electoral Commission to scrutinise proposed referendum questions will be diminished in comparison with the position in UK law. But why should ministers and not Parliament determine these matters? Second, could the Minister answer this? Do referendums under the bill published today have to be binary? Yes, no, leave remain. Could multi-question referendums be established under this bill? And could multi-choice referendums also be permitted? And finally, let me ask this very briefly. I agree with the Minister that Scottish independence could be established only by referendum. Clearly, we could not have independence without a lawful referendum. But what are the other matters which SNP ministers are proposing to put to referendum? They claim this bill is a framework bill for referendums in general. I suspect it's no such thing, and that in reality it's a Trojan horse for a wildcat IndyRef 2. But the Minister could prove me wrong. So what are the other issues, besides independence, which he plans to put to the people in a referendum?
Michael Russell.
Presiding Officer, there were a number of questions there. Let me do my best to answer them. First of all, in questions of priorities, of course, my friend, the Health Secretary, is working very hard in the health service. Some of the results of that are already clear. Scotland's core A&E services are the best performing in the UK, actually for almost 4 years. We have a record high in health funding. We have a record high in patient satisfaction. NHS staffing is up by over 13,600, or 10.7% under the SNP. Patient safety is massively increased, and 5.1 million people are now registered with an NHS dentist. Of course, work continues, but the record of that is a good one. Let me move on to the question of apparently the First Minister attempting to achieve the referendum by stealth. Not only did the First Minister announce her intention to take forward this bill in the 24th of April, but she was so stealthy about this that she sent a card to every single household in Scotland, every single one, which said, "We'll offer people a choice of a future for Scotland as an independent European nation." How stealthy is that? A stealth referendum. I have to say, absolutely. How stealthy was that? Now,
can we calm down a bit, please, if we wish to listen to the Cabinet Secretary?
How stealthy it is to send a message to every single house in Scotland.
Excuse me, Mr. Russell. It's very difficult for anyone to hear anything except front bench people shouting at each other. So, Mr. Russell.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Let me now address the issues raised by Mr. Tompkins regarding the bill. First of all, Mr. Tompkins is a constitutional lawyer. He understands at Westminster, as here, the government proposes and Parliament scrutinises and decides. That actually is exactly what happens in the Political Parties Elections and Referendum Act passed by Westminster in the year 2000. It is exactly the same process. So if the member wishes to have a system in which Parliament actually proposes the referendum, in a sense, he can move to that system. It's not a system at Westminster, it's not a system here, but of course, Parliament will be able to scrutinise and decide on every single detail. Finally, on the question of referenda, if there are developments to this bill that Mr. Tompkins wishes to see, the bill itself is open to amendment. The bill will be going through a system in which that is a welcome matter, because I've always welcomed full debate on these matters. The problem with Mr Tompkins' position is this. Mr Tompkins doesn't want this Parliament to decide. He wants Westminster to decide. No. He actually wants the Tory Prime Minister, whoever that is, to decide and simply say no. That is not democracy. That's not what we'll be doing.
Richard Leonard.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement? Labour delivered devolution. In the Scottish Parliament's 20th anniversary year, Labour continues to support and defend devolution. Up until Brexit, the devolution settlement founded on the 98 Act worked well. And whilst it is evident that there is a breakdown of trust between the present UK government and the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales, this is not because it is a UK government, it is because it is a Tory government. Cabinet Secretary, you note in your statement that Theresa May, and I quote, has had no interest in seeing the devolved settlement observed. But it's clear that the SNP government here does not observe the devolution settlement either, and is once again today seeking to advance the cause of the breakup of the United Kingdom. So does the Cabinet Secretary not understand that his party's obsession with the creation of a separate Scottish state is a distraction from the real issues that this Parliament was brought in existence to tackle?
Michael Russell.
Well, let me start by just paying a brief tribute to my former shadow, Neil Findlay, who regrettably I don't think is in the chamber today. I mean, it's no secret that he and I were not soulmates, but I do regret that any individual has decided that they don't want to continue in the role, and I wish him absolutely well in the future, and I hope whatever he does decide to do, he enjoys that more than being a member of the Labour group. I just also want to make the point that there are 14 members of the Labour group present. I just wonder where the others are. Are they still in office or still attending? But let me come to the points about this referendum. I don't agree with it, and I don't agree with Mr Leonard quite respectfully. I don't believe this is in any sense a distraction, because the question that Mr Leonard has to address is this one. How does he achieve the things he wants to see happen if there is a constant block upon them from a Tory government at Westminster? Because we have not seen, and I have lived through even more Tory governments than Mr Leonard has lived through, and the reality of the situation is that whatever happens, that is what is the block on progress in Scotland. Now, there's an opportunity here to say, how could we move forward to a more socially just, to a more fair, to a more equal Scotland? And he and I have a genuine disagreement about how that will be done. But I have to say the evidence of the last 50, 60, 70 years is on my side, because the evidence shows that it cannot be done through the United Kingdom, but it could be and should be done through this Scottish Parliament. And therefore I would say to the Labour members, join us in that task, because actually in that task there would be a substantial majority in this chamber for the type of equal, fair Scotland that we all want to see. And the barrier to that happening is regrettably on those benches, but alas, still on those benches too. It does not have to be like that.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. I'm also grateful for the advance copy of the statement, and I welcome the publication of the bill today. And I certainly commit to work with any other political party that has serious proposals for making the process more democratic and ensuring that powers are properly with Parliament, not ministers. We've done that before, and we'll be willing to do it again if there are serious proposals, even if some political parties haven't recognised that the collapse in their vote last week does mean and necessitate a change in their position in relation to the political crisis that we're living through at the moment. One aspect of that crisis is the hacking of democracy. What we've seen is a growing body of evidence that the 2016 referendum was affected not only by empty promises on the side of a bus or racist rhetoric from Farage and Johnson, but also by dodgy money and dodgy data. What opportunity is there to make sure that this bill prevents the future undermining of the democratic process in the same way as we saw in the 2016 EU referendum?
Michael Russell.
I think the member makes a very important point. We have seen in the referendum that took place a great deal of shady activity, and probably worse than shady activity. And we see today, of course, a charge pending against one of the Tory leadership contenders for a misrepresentation. Of course, it's up to the courts to decide how that matter proceeds. So, in all these circumstances, I am very open to discussion with any party in this chamber that wants to strengthen legislation. Not just this piece of legislation. There are, of course, two other bills due to come on electoral matters. One I've indicated, which is on the franchise, and then a second one on the conduct of elections. It is certainly possible to look at how, after the members have seen those proposals, how they could be strengthened. I think the whole chamber, showing that it supports democracy and the rules that underpin democracy, would be a powerful message. And I'll work with anybody to send that message and to make sure elections are run properly.
Willie Rennie.
The Cabinet Secretary has learnt nothing from the chaos of Brexit. Surely by now, even he must understand that the economic damage and national division that is caused by breaking up long-term economic partnerships. Independence will mount chaos on top of the Brexit chaos. The Minister has also got a lot to learn about building consensus. In one breath, he appeals to us all to work together reasonably and maturely. Top of the Brexit chaos. The Minister has also got a lot to learn about building consensus. In one breath, he appeals to us all to work together reasonably and maturely before launching another attack on every single one of us. He's got an awful lot to learn about building consensus. He says there are no preconditions for his cross-party talks. No preconditions apart from that is another independence referendum. Does he not understand that this is a major barrier to our participation in those talks?
Michael Russell.
I regret that, and I hope Mr. Rennie will think that one. I hope Mr. Rennie will think that matter through, because if there are no preconditions, there are no preconditions. The First Minister made it absolutely clear that the cross-party talks are to look at alternatives which parties wish to bring forward. I've tried to create a structure for those which is non-confrontational, that allows people to take part without confrontation. I would hope that all the parties would take part in those, certainly through the first stage of talking to the interlocutor to see what the agendas are, because if there are alternatives, those alternatives should be put on the table. I cannot say fairer than that. It is important. But the other question that needs to be addressed in here, and I put it in one form to Richard Leonard, and I put it to Willie Rennie very clearly, what is the alternative to a no-deal Brexit when we get to that moment at Westminster? Do we just do what we are told? Do we just accept the economic chaos and disaster that will take place? He may not have sympathy with, and I don't have much sympathy with, the Secretary of State for Scotland, but the Secretary of State for Scotland described the potential of Brexit itself as an economic catastrophe. The reality is that is where we are heading. That is where it is being driven by Tory leadership candidates. What will Mr. Rennie do in those circumstances? That's a vital question, and he does need to answer it.
Members will be aware of the inordinate time that party leaders' questions have taken. So if I ask for brevity, please bear it in mind so that as many members as possible can get in. Tom Arthur, followed by Murdo Fraser.
Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that it should be for the Scottish Parliament and not Westminster to decide on the question of whether people in Scotland are to be given a choice over their future, particularly given the chaos unfolding in the Westminster Parliament?
Michael Russell.
Yes, and if you substituted any other country for Scotland within that question, you would realise how obvious it is. Of course, the people of Scotland should decide on their own future.
Murdo Fraser, followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister talked in his statement about consensus, about reconciliation and leaving behind negativity and nastiness. But he has never apologised for suggesting that our colleagues in Westminster are traitors to Scotland. So in the spirit of reconciliation and a fresh start, will he now do so?
Michael Russell.
It's very difficult for me to apologise for something I didn't do, but let me try and reach out. If those colleagues and those people who support them on those benches were offended by that, I am sorry that that took place. Now, can we now perhaps accept that we should be looking forward to try and find a way in which we can work together? And will Murdo Fraser commit his party to sit down and have the conversations we need to have?
Jenny Gilruth, followed by Elaine Smith.
Thank you. Scotland overwhelmingly decided that it wanted to remain at the heart of Europe, both in 2016 and in last week's EU elections. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell Parliament to what extent the UK Government has listened to the views of the people of Scotland during the Brexit process?
Michael Russell.
Well, not at all, because there has been, as I said in my statement, a deliberate attempt by the Prime Minister to ensure that those voices were not listened to. The Prime Minister is not a person who finds dialogue easy, I have to say. But if there is to be a change, and we're all hoping for positive change, I mean, I know it's often proved not to be the case. It's always dangerous to say things can't get any worse, because clearly they sometimes can. But in these circumstances, there is an opportunity for change at Westminster. The next meeting of the JMC EN will be held sometime in June. I would be delighted to discover that there was a changed attitude at it.
Elaine Smith, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you. In the 13th year of this government, over 1 million people in Scotland are living in poverty, with children going hungry, rough sleeping on the increase in pensioners unable to afford to heat their homes. So where does the SNP's priorities actually lie? The statement talks about consensus. When will the Scottish Government respond to the clear consensus of anti-poverty organisations calling for urgent action, make tackling poverty its priority rather than focusing yet again on the Constitution?
Michael Russell.
Yeah, I mean, I would refer the member to the UN report last week, because I think it's quite important that we deal with facts. The UN report is absolutely clear where the responsibility, alas, lies. It lies with successive Westminster governments. And I say to the members, I've said to the leader of her party here, there is a way to move on from that, to do the incredibly hard work that we're required to recreate Scotland in the way in which we would like to see it recreated, where poverty is eliminated. But that requires us to have a national consensus about putting the resources of the country to the good of the country. And we can't do that unless we have control of those resources. This is a simple issue. I commend the member for her passion about this. It is a passion that she has felt strongly. It is a passion she is right to feel strongly. Poverty shames Scotland. But the only way we will move on fully and finally from that is to make sure that all the resources, all the effort of the country is devoted to that. And that cannot be done within the current settlement.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In relation to the Scottish Government offer of cross-party talks, does the Cabinet Secretary believe that there could be some consensus around, for example, migration, given Scotland's particular circumstances recognised most recently by, for example, the Director General of the CBI?
Michael Russell.
I think the member makes a very strong, good point. I've actually been on panels with opposition members. We've actually all been able to agree, even the Conservatives have been able to agree, that the devolution of migration is something that should move forward. The problem is the timescale and the decision-making process. There is no timescale for this, and the decision-making process in the Tory government has been entirely negative. The current Prime Minister is a woman obsessed by migration. She is against any form of migration. She talks with pride about ending freedom of movement, and that's a matter of grave shame and real damage to Scotland. Now, what could happen is, if there was a willingness to change, for example, the Conservatives could bring that to the cross-party talks, we could agree that that point was put to Westminster with the complete agreement of this chamber, and we would hope that that would have some effect. Now, I'm very happy that that could happen. There's something that could be backed by every single one of us. I just hope that that might be something which in those talks could move forward. Oh, sorry, there are some members of the Tory party that are not willing to back that. Well, that's a pity, because the effect of ending freedom of movement will be profoundly felt in every single constituency and region of Scotland which they represent.
Donald Cameron.
Thank you. Does the Cabinet Secretary believe that referendums under this bill should be advisory or binding? And can he point me to the provision in this bill which states the Scottish Government will respect the result of referendums?
Michael Russell.
Well, I think that you have to be firm on one side or the other. For example, the UK government and the EU referendum was meant to be advisory, but apparently now it is the most binding thing that you could possibly decide on and cannot be changed in any way. So if the member wants to seriously engage with this bill, and I'm sure he does want to seriously engage with the bill, let us have that debate as to what the right thing to happen is. Now, it's a rather curious position that we've just heard from Mr Tompkins. Mr Tompkins has lambasted us for apparently not having any desire to have Parliament involved in this. I've just said, let's have parliamentary debate about this, and Mr Tompkins shouts, what's your view? The reality of the situation is you can't win with them, but I do hope we can have that debate and we'll come down on one side or the other, and maybe it will be an amendment from one of the Tories that allows us to do so.
That concludes questions on the Cabinet Secretary's statement. Apologies to Stuart McMillan, James Kelly and Fulton McGregor for being unable to bring them in. We will move on to the next item of business. If those leaving the chamber could do so quietly, please. The next item of business is portfolio questions. And again, I would like to get as many people to participate as possible, so short questions and answers, please. Question number 1 in the health and sport portfolio is Rachael Hamilton.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to prevent passive smoking.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
We published our action plan on tobacco control, raising Scotland's tobacco-free generation in June 2018. The action plan sets out 15 measures which are intended to prevent the take-up of smoking, protect people from second-hand smoke and support people to quit. These measures will help deliver our ambition for a tobacco-free generation by 2034. All of them will reduce passive smoking. On second-hand smoke specifically, the action plan contains measures to ban smoking around hospital buildings and remove smoking from areas where children learn and play and from communal stairwells.
Rachael Hamilton.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and he sets out that the Smoking Health and Social Care Scotland Act 2005 does make it an offence to smoke in enclosed public places, but it doesn't specifically cover those children's play parks, the outdoor school facilities or other playgrounds. And we know that the passive smoking effects are exacerbated in children due to their lungs not being fully developed. I would ask that if the Scottish Government have any plans to follow the Welsh Government, who are enacting changes in the Public Health Wales Act 2017 to ban smoking in outdoor facilities and play parks.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
For the question, which I think is an important point. So the action plan includes a commitment to monitor the developments in Wales and also to monitor the implementation of guidelines that we issued to local authorities in 2017. So we'll do that before we then consider whether legislation would be required, and I think that's the correct way. As I said, the guidance was published in 2017, so we would plan to engage with local authorities on the implementation later this year.
Supplementary from Kenneth Gibson.
Presiding Officer, does the Minister agree that the Smoking Health and Social Care Scotland Bill passed in 2005 has been a resounding success, with an 86% reduction in passive smoking in bars, 17% fall in heart attacks and an 18% decline in child asthma hospital admissions in the year following its introduction alone? And does he therefore agree it is time for the Tories to finally apologise for opposing this bill tooth and nail at stage 1 and stage 3, given the thousands of lives saved since its enactment?
Joe Fitzpatrick.
There's no question that the ban had actually a very quick impact, and by the assessment in 2008, we very quickly saw that there was an immediate impact. I think further assessment will show a wider range of benefits from the ban. I First of all, I think it's important to recognise the commitment of Mr Gibson going right back into the first Parliament on this issue. However, I think on his final point, I think we've moved some distance from then, and I think what I'm hearing from the Conservatives in the Chamber today is support for this particular public health measure. So I think I'm more minded to try and work with the individuals here on this and other public health measures. I think if across the Chamber these matters, and this is not the only one, the issues that we have around obesity, alcohol and drugs are all other matters where I think we need to rise above politics and work together to do what is best for the people of Scotland.
Question number 2, Gil Paterson.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the reported concerns of NHS boards regarding the possible impact of Brexit on their services.
Jean Freeman.
The Scottish Government shares the concerns of NHS boards, including on supply continuity, research and workforce. We continue to plan and prepare so we can minimise the impacts, but I need to be clear that we cannot remove or mitigate all the risks involved with Brexit. Alongside activation of our Scottish Government Resilience Room, we've established a health response hub to assist boards. We've written to EU staff and are supporting those staff who are applying for settled status. Many medicine supply issues are outside our control, but we have established a medicine shortage response group and are working with NHS National Services on medical devices stockpiling.
Gil Paterson.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? In light of the EU election result, which demonstrated that Scotland overwhelmingly rejects Brexit, and in the backdrop of a potential new Tory Prime Minister crashing us out of the EU without a deal, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what preparations the Scottish Government is making to protect our NHS in the event of a no deal?
Jean Freeman.
Well, of course, as the member knows, I've just outlined what those preparations are, but let me repeat. We cannot mitigate all the impacts of a no-deal Brexit, which will see a significant shock to our economic system, which will in due course produce additional demands on our health services. With the end of freedom of movement, we know in health and in particular in social care, then we will be severely challenged in terms of our workforce. And it is, of course, worth just saying before I finish, Presiding Officer, it is quite astonishing that in this century, in this country, we are busy working out how to feed and look after our citizens because we are being taken against our will out of the European Union.
Question number 3, Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to encourage the recruitment of GPs in rural communities.
Jean Freeman.
The new GP contract developed in partnership with the BMA is helping to reduce doctors' workload and make general practice a more attractive career in both rural and urban practices, enhancing the GP role as expert medical generalists. We have, in addition, a package of measures to support rural general practice, including significantly enhancing recruitment incentives and recruitment and relocation support, supporting the Scottish Rural Medical Collaborative, investing in support for IT improvements to rural health boards and support for rural dispensing practices. Even so, there are other issues around the flexibility of the contracts, which I take very seriously, and we will continue to consider how we can address these concerns.
Michelle Ballantyne.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. However, it's clear that it's not working quickly enough. This week, Trinent Medical Practice in East Lothian took the decision to stop taking advance bookings for GP appointments. They are quite clear about what has prompted this decision, an ongoing shortage of GPs within the practice, which has come about as a result of recruitment issues. The decision to halt advance bookings has clear implications to the accessibility of GP services for local residents, particularly those who work during the week. So what assurances can the Cabinet Secretary offer me and the residents in East Lothian that other medical practices across South Scotland will not have to take similar measures to make up for the Scottish Government's failure to recruit and retain GPs?
Jean Freeman.
Well, of course, I don't accept the premise that the member just ended with there. And I should say one of the greatest challenges in terms of retaining our workforce, in addition, of course, to Brexit, are the decisions that the UK government has made on pension increases, which are proving exceptionally challenging across our health and care workforce. And if you don't believe me, go and ask those Royal Colleges, the BMA, who I'll meet later, and many others who have raised those matters with me. And if we only had the powers, of course, we wouldn't have made such a foolish decision in the first place, and if we ever had, we would reverse it now. What is happening with this contract, which of course is relatively new, is that as we need to recruit into those multidisciplinary teams in order to provide the right care for patients at the right point, then we are seeing in some areas, but not in all, challenges. We are also seeing NHS 24 introducing itself to significantly improve matters, particularly now looking at Dumfries and Galloway. And it is, of course, our responsibility, along with our health and social care partners, where a GP practice is particularly challenged, to act immediately to try and intervene and support those patients.
Unusually in this session, I've got a question, and that would be, what part of short and succinct do members in this chamber not understand? So could we try and have some regard for all our fellow members and really take on short and succinct? Iain Gray, question number 4.
To ask the Scottish Government how it will ensure that more young people and their families managing long-term health conditions can access art therapy.
Claire Hawkey.
Art therapists are a small professional group, but they have a huge contribution to make in helping people of all ages to improve their general development, social interaction and communication skills, and to support mental and physical rehabilitation. As with other allied health professionals, access to art therapy is based on clinical need.
Iain Gray.
The Teapot Trust, founded by my constituent Dr Young, has gone from strength to strength and now provides art therapy in all of Scotland's children's hospitals, as well as Great Ormond Street and Alderhay. They are also now working with some CAM services and would like to expand this. Indeed, I wrote to the Minister for Mental Health recently to ask if she would meet Dr Young and I, but she replied that she was too busy. The Trust today announced their new Chief Executive, Sarah Randall. I wonder if the Minister can be prevailed upon to find a half hour in her diary to meet myself and Ms Randall.
Claire Hawkey.
I thank Mr Gray for his question. I am well aware of the work that the Teapot Trust does, and I congratulate Laura Young on the work that she's done. From my own clinical practice, I'm well aware of the value that art therapists bring to all services, both children and young people services, and also to adult services. If the member writes to me again, I would certainly reconsider that. As he is aware, he has been a minister himself. Sometimes diary constraints mean you can't meet everyone that you would like to.
Short supplementary, Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can the Minister provide an update on the numbers of art therapists working within CAMS? And also, what's the wider vision around access to therapy for services, not only in the NHS, but also in social care services?
Claire Hawkey.
As I said in my previous answer, obviously it's up to NHS boards to determine staffing required in their areas based on their local need, but I recognise that art therapists can provide a valuable addition. I don't have the numbers that he has asked for, but I can commit to writing to him with those figures.
Question number 5, Tom Mason.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to improve NHS Grampian's performance in meeting the 18 weeks referral to treatment target of at least 90%.
Jean Freeman.
As part of the Waiting Times Improvement Plan, additional funding to NHS Grampian has so far supported a new cataract procedure room, which has provided additional patient treatment areas and additional endoscopies. In addition, NHS Grampian is working with neighbouring health boards to maximise the use of capacity with a focus on general surgery and urology to reduce the number of patients waiting the longest.
Tom Mason.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Figures published yesterday show that rather than meeting the 90% target, Grampian's performance for patient journeys within 18 weeks has declined again to 61.7%. This is the single worst monthly performance for any health board in any month since at least January 2011. Does the Cabinet Secretary not agree this is shocking? Will she take the opportunity to apologise to the patients in Grampian? And will she admit that whatever grand plans and strategies she
As of March, the end of March this year, the number of ongoing waits, i.e. those waiting the longest for inpatient and day cases, has been reduced by 8.5%, the first quarter in nearly 3.5 years where there has been that reduction. A consequence of that is when you focus on those waiting the longest, that those who are introduced into the waiting times will wait a bit longer. Inevitably, the plan makes it clear, it shows you in a graph, it goes in that direction before it starts to improve. That's where we are. Nonetheless, that is not acceptable for any of our patients who have to wait longer, and that is absolutely the focus of that waiting times plan, and we will continue to see improvement. Right now, we're on track to meet exactly where we said we'd be in October this year.
Short supplementary, please, Monica.
Thank you. Allegations of fraudulent use of previous government waiting time improvement funds are under investigation in NHS Lanarkshire. Is the Cabinet Secretary aware of any other issue like this in Grampian or any other health board, and can she provide an update on the Lanarkshire situation?
Jean Freeman.
No other board has raised these matters with us, and of course they are all very aware and are looking at making sure that whatever has happened in NHS Lanarkshire, that they have the right mitigation procedures in their own boards to try and ensure that they are not vulnerable in that way. Nonetheless, the Lanarkshire situation is the subject of ongoing investigation, and until that is concluded, I cannot comment further on it.
Question number 6, Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what recent discussions it's had with NHS Lothian regarding staff car parking at the Royal Infirmary.
Jean Freeman.
So our discussions continue with NHS Lothian on this matter, which both the board and we take seriously. They have taken steps to increase and manage availability of spaces, creating an additional 334 car parking spaces, which will be available from the 9th of July this year, introducing controls to limit car park use to those accessing health services and staff with permits, undertaking discussions with travel providers on service provision to try and make sure that public transport is more appropriate for that particular site, and the promotion of a pan-Lothian lift share programme. The board will continue to engage with patients and staff, and we will continue to be in touch with them to see what more in the way of constructive ideas for initiatives might be taken forward.
Jeremy Balfour.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer? I've been contacted by a number of constituents who are employed at the hospital. Many are shift workers and are concerned about the cost of parking at work and their safety travelling to and from work since the parking permits have been revoked. Will the Minister therefore agree to refund the cost of parking?
Jean Freeman.
Well, of course, this matter has been raised with me previously by the other member, Ms Graham. We continue to discuss with the board the allocation of staff permits and the difficulties that may have arisen over changes in those, and I'm very happy to update Mr Balfour as those discussions are concluded.
Question number 7, Annabel Ewing.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on out-of-hours urgent care in Fife.
Jean Freeman.
I can advise the member that Fife Health and Social Care Partnership are still in the process of engaging with the community and hope to take proposals to the next integrated joint board meeting at the end of June.
Annabel Ewing.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer, and whilst I appreciate it is of course important that all representations be duly taken into account, I am nonetheless concerned that matters are dragging on, and hopefully, assuming that the Queen Margaret Hospital in Dunfermline will be one of the sites selected, when will the new out-of-hours urgent care regime actually come into effect?
Jean Freeman.
I understand the member's frustration. I also understand there are still a number of processes to go through before this reaches a satisfactory conclusion. However, I have received assurances from the Health and Social Care Partnership that, assuming there are no further unplanned delays, the new out-of-hours regime should be in place before the winter this year.
A very short supplementary, will there any?
An innovative solution has been developed for North East Fife and St Andrews. It means that people won't have to travel to Kirkcaldy unless there's exceptional circumstances. But there's been no provision overnight in St Andrews for a year now. The decision has been delayed twice. Can the Minister give us a guarantee that there will be no further delays?
Jean Freeman.
No, I can't give that guarantee, and of course I'm aware of the innovative solution, given that the Scottish Government played a major role in brokering that innovative solution. I'm grateful to Mr Rennie for recognising that, I think. What I can say is that there are proper processes that need to go through, and the board and the local authority, and importantly the IJB, need to be given the time to do that in order to get it right. I can't guarantee that there will be no further delays, but both the IJB and the relevant partners are very aware of people's anxiety on this and desire to see what the conclusions are, and they are equally aware of my desire to know that they are moving in the right direction. I hope that when they meet in June, they will be able to conclude on those proposals.
Quick supplementary, Claire Baker.
The Cabinet Secretary will know that part of the delay was caused by the participation request being granted by NHS 5, and this is the first time that piece of legislation has been used by an NHS board. Will she commit to reflecting on the experience of individuals who went through that process, because it is the first time it's been used and NHS 5 had to seek legal advice about whether it was appropriate or not?
Jean Freeman.
Yes, I'm very happy to have further discussions with NHS 5 about the experience of that, and to hear from those who went through that process and consider what more we might do.
Right, we'll see if Ms Gilruth knows what very short supplementary means. Jenny Gilruth.
Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that it is vital the IGB continues to engage with communities and represent residents in Glen Office and to develop their plans further?
Jean Freeman.
I think Ms Gilruth raises an important point. I do agree. While an IJB may not be able to meet every request of a local community, I would expect them to clearly demonstrate how any plans they bring forward have been shaped by engagement with that community. If nothing else, in my opinion, it is a matter of simple respect towards the communities that any IJB serves.
Question number 8, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, President Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what steps it's taken to reduce the amount of meat containing nitrites being served in hospitals.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
All hospital food must meet national food, fluid and nutrition standards. Under the NHS Scotland procurement framework, all suppliers must adhere to all relevant requirements, including those under the Food Safety Act as amended 1990 and Scottish, UK and EU food safety regulations.
Liam Kerr.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Look, the fact remains it's been 4 years since the publication of a report which linked processed meats, nitrites and bowel cancer. So does the Minister agree that this type of food should be nowhere near hospital menus, and instead that high-quality food produced right here in Scotland makes its way into Scottish hospitals?
Joe Fitzpatrick.
I think the member might want to speak to some of the high-quality food producers who use nitrates in Scotland, which are in line with food safety rules and guidelines. However, on this issue, Scotland has led the UK by setting a minimum standard of our hospital food. All hospital food has to, as I've said, meet the food, fluid and nutritional standards, and that takes account of the latest scientific advice on the amount of red and processed meat that can be consumed for a healthy, balanced diet. So that is already no more than 70 grams of red and processed meat in a day.
We'll now move on to the communities and local government portfolio. If we could organise ourselves quickly, please. We are already ahead of time. No, we're not ahead of time, we're behind time. Question number 1, Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what steps it's taking to tackle the rising levels of child poverty.
Aileen Campbell.
Thank you. Scotland is the only UK country to have set statutory targets for reducing child poverty. Our Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan outlines the concrete actions we will take to deliver progress on those targets, and our first report due next month will set out in more detail the progress we have made. We are taking these bold actions in the face of the UK Government cuts and austerity, which has seen the Scottish budget reduced by £2 billion in real terms since 2010-11, and will see £3.7 billion cut from social security spending by 2020-21, risking the progress that we've made.
Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, all the evidence and all the projections suggest that child poverty in Scotland is going to continue to increase. And whilst I accept the point being made about the actions of the Tory government supported by the benches in here, that poverty is rising. The fact is the Scottish Government have tools available to it to start to address this. Oxfam Scotland, for example, are arguing it's time to fast-track Scotland's income supplement. Will the Government look at what powers it has and how it's going to use those powers and bring forward a statement to this Parliament setting out what it intends to do in the short term to stop the increases, the unacceptable increases in child poverty in Scotland?
Aileen Campbell.
Yeah, as I said in my response, I will be updating Parliament next month on the progress report associated with the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan. And within that plan, we committed to the introduction of the income supplement. And again, I'll be able to update the Parliament on the progress we've made on that particular point. But I think Mr Rowley should also recognise that what Professor Alston said when he said that devolved administrations have tried to mitigate the worst impacts of austerity, but mitigation comes at a price and it's not sustainable. So we are doing what we can with the powers that we have, investing the resources that we have to soften the blows of Tory austerity. But it is not always sustainable to do that, and we need to make sure that we raise the debate and are in a position where we can pursue our own policies to tackle the social problems that exist in Scotland. So we'll continue to do what we're doing. We'll continue to mitigate this and soften the blows of what the UK Government are doing at Westminster, and we'll continue to use the powers that we have to help children have the best chance and the opportunity to flourish. And we can do so in partnership, but I think we also need to recognise that austerity comes fairly and squarely and is recognised from Westminster.
Question number 2, Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the level of new social housing building. Ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the level of new social housing building in Dumfries and Galloway.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Local authorities have the statutory responsibility for assessing housing need and demand in their area and setting out how requirements for housing will be met in their local housing strategies. Dumfries and Galloway produced its LHS in 2018, supported by a housing need and demand assessment which was agreed as being robust and credible by the Scottish Government in 2016. The Scottish Government will provide over £91 million in this parliamentary term for affordable housing in Dumfries and Galloway, and around 800 homes for social rent are expected to be delivered.
Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Minister for that answer. One of the challenges faced to water supply issues, and likewise in the Lockerbie area there have been challenges about access to wastewater treatment works. So could I ask the Minister if he will agree to look into these issues to see what can be done across government to ensure that Scottish Water invest in the
I don't have to look into these matters because I know exactly what is going on. There has been a huge amount of cooperation between Scottish Water, Dumfries and Galloway Council and some of the housing associations, particularly Cunningham Housing Association, to resolve the problems that exist in Gretna. I'm hopeful that a solution can be found to all of that with that continued work in partnership. And in terms of other areas around Dumfries and Galloway and around that deliver homes and businesses across our country, would make sure that any barriers are taken down. That particularly works well when there is cooperation, and I'm thankful to Dumfries and Galloway Council.
Short supplementary, Emma Harper.
Thank you. Given that the previous Labour government in Scotland only managed to build 6 houses in 4 years, would the Minister join me in congratulating Dumfries and Galloway Council and local housing associations, including Lordburn Housing, on the high level of accessible housing that they are providing to people across Dumfries and Galloway?
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Since 2007, this government has delivered 1,782 social houses in the Dumfries and Galloway area, with many more to come during the course of this parliamentary term. I'm very pleased that we currently have
and policies in Scotland. Now, I was going to say I look forward to hearing more concrete actions from the Cabinet Secretary, but it looks like he's about to explain how he is going to assure that more work is given to the Ards and Five.
Can I just say a little thing, formal thing? Don't both be standing at the same time. Cabinet Secretary, I'm calling you now.
I'm just particularly eager, Presiding Officer.
It doesn't matter if you're eager, you don't do it. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Point taken, Presiding Officer. Two key issues I've raised today in exploring exhaustively all of the powers that we could use. The new elements are around decommissioning, specifically what has to be put to Parliament, and also use of the Crown Estate, which has been devolved to Scotland. I cannot use some of the other areas that have been suggested, but I'm determined within our competencies to use those, and I would seek the consensus of Parliament to progress with them as we explore them, to make that culture of expectation about investment in Scotland real and meaningful, and not just wait for the sector to deliver. That's two key areas I've outlined today.
Mr Lockhart.
Thanks very much. Cabinet Secretary, we will work together with you on those areas. I appreciate some of these powers have come to the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government recently, but it does beg the question in terms of the powers that have been with the Scottish Government for a long term, what you have been doing in the past to secure more work using those powers. Presiding Officer, let me also make it clear that responsibility for securing more work in the supply chain does lie also with the UK Government. And today we're also calling on the UK Government to take steps to encourage EDF to award work to the Fife Yards and elsewhere in Scotland. And I have written to the UK Minister to meet with her to explore what actions can be taken. I'd like to make a bit of progress, but Mr Mason, I'll give way a bit later. Presiding Officer, the risk that these turbine jackets will be built overseas is the latest example of how the Scottish Government has really failed to realise the potential in the renewable sector. We heard earlier about the GMB report that sets out a history of broken promises to the renewables industry in Scotland. The report shows that over the past decade there have been many promises of a jobs and manufacturing bonanza in the sector. In 2010, the SNP's low-carbon economic strategy promised 130,000 jobs. Let me continue, Cabinet Secretary. This strategy promised 130,000 jobs in renewables by 2020. Alex Salmond proclaimed that Scotland would become the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy. In reality, according to the latest ONS figures, there are just over 21,000 full-time jobs in renewable energy in Scotland. That's less than 20% of the amount of jobs that were promised. I'm sorry, I've only got 7 minutes. We also have a negative balance of trade in the low-carbon and renewable sector in Scotland. We import £230 million more than we export in this sector, showing that the manufacturing base in Scotland is not benefiting from the growth in renewable energy. This failure to realise Scotland's potential in renewables has also been evident in the Scottish Government's track record of investments in the sector. In 2014-2015, we saw the failure of tidal wave companies Palamis and Aquamarine, with the loss of over £40 million of taxpayer money. These failures show, and I think other members have highlighted this, the Scottish Government lacks a clear, long-term strategy for the renewable sector in Scotland. And the most productive action the Scottish Government can now take is to work together with the UK Government under the industrial strategy, the clean growth strategy and the offshore wind sector deal to maximise opportunities for the sector in Scotland. According to DF Barnes, the owner of BIFAB, the UK Government sector deal is a laudable commitment. They welcome the commitment to achieve 60% of UK content in projects. The UK sector deal also provides visibility on future contracts for difference auctions, with support of up to over £500 million in the next auction to come on stream later this month. This is in addition to subsidies provided by the UK Government, totalling some £52 billion since 2010 for the renewable sector. The UK sector deal also commits to increasing UK content to 60%, increasing exports fivefold to £2.6 billion by 2030, and increasing the representation of women in the sector to a third by 2030. Cabinet Secretary, I'll give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
Would Dean Lockhart support the position that conditionality should be attached to contract for difference to ensure that supply chain content, local content, is absolutely guaranteed rather than just hoped for as part of the wind sector deal?
You're now in your last minute, Mr. Lockhart.
Thank you. The UK Minister responsible has made it clear that each CFD has to be looked at on its own merits. I don't think you can put in place a blanket system of conditionality. That's not the way the sector works. The Cabinet Secretary knows well that's not how the sector works. Presiding Officer, I do have to wrap up. The renewable sector in Scotland has benefited from the financial support, significant support from the UK Government and billions of pounds in subsidies through CFDs. But, as we've heard, this has not translated into the jobs, manufacturing opportunities and the investment promised by the SNP. That's because, as we saw clearly earlier today, this is a government with only one priority, and it's not the renewable sector in Scotland. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lockhart. I now call on Mark Ruskell. Mr. Ruskell, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank the Labour Party for bringing this debate forward today, because this is Scotland's climate emergency. It's where rhetoric meets reality. It's where communities and workers are either left behind in the fossil age or are the leaders of the renewables revolution under a Green New Deal. And we all know the lessons of history, the decimation caused by the closure of the coal mines in the 80s and the alienation of communities so cruelly parasitised by the Brexiteers in the EU referendum. Communities in Fife are now crying out for a just transition to a bright future, whether that's phasing out Moss Moran, reconnecting with rail in forgotten towns, or ramping up low-carbon manufacturing. So the Greens back the Fife Ready for Renewal campaign, and it would be an utter scandal if EDF constructed a wind farm just a few miles off the Fife coast, in sight of Methil, where former skilled workers at Bifab have to walk past a mothballed yard every day on their way to try and find new work. Where is the climate justice in that? Where is the just transition in that? If EDF can't support jobs in the very communities that host their developments, then we should hit them where it hurts, including through divestment campaigns. Now, 2 years ago, we were hopeful that the pipeline of wind farms on the horizon was going to deliver jobs at Bifab. It was just a matter of bridging the gap for 6 months, keeping finances afloat during a traumatic few years for the company, and then contracts would flow once again. But what we've seen is a level of coordination and manipulation of procurement rules by state-backed contractors to lock Bifab out of the work. Now, these companies are acting against the spirit and the detail of their energy consents that demand local content and demand local jobs. So to find a way to resolve this betrayal, the role of the Crown Estate Scotland as a landlord is critical, alongside those of the consenting bodies. So I'm pleased that the recent offshore wind summit zeroed in on the Crown Estate's role. I very much welcome the comments of the Cabinet Secretary and his desire for ministerial direction in this regard. That's welcome. But we do need to learn the lessons here, because, of course, state-backed companies will always find it easier to accept financial guarantee risks. They're able to accept losses with a strategic eye to longer-term growth in markets, and they can bear the risks to jump on the back of new markets, such as floating wind. So we also need a state that can create these new markets as well, invest and share in the rewards of investment, taking the lead and crowding in finance from the private sector. The state needs to carry the risk, especially in the early development of new technology. In a second, but not to fall into the trap of socialising all that risk, only to step back and watch the rewards become wholly privatised.
Alistair Allen.
Thank the member for giving way. I'm conscious of the fact that the Arnish Yard in my own constituency has had some more positive news perhaps, but does the member agree that to ensure a future for that and indeed the other yards, we need to maximise apprenticeships and other training opportunities into the long term?
Mark Ruskell.
Absolutely, and that's critical to the Green New Deal that we need to create in Scotland, linking in education, linking in apprenticeships, and that's very much the case in Fife, where I know I've met so many exciting young people coming through Fife College looking to get into the renewable energy industry, but just simply not finding the apprenticeships there to carry them then into their careers. The great Labour pioneer Tom Johnston would be spinning in his grave to see the dismantling of the state as the thinker, researcher, planner, financier, builder and operator of our energy infrastructure in the UK. The legacy of his revolutionary hydro board, established under Churchill's government, was deregulated and flogged off. But it's clear that the future is wind, and the deployment of offshore wind will need to grow, at least doubling the project pipeline by 2030. Wind will provide the lion's share of the energy that we need to heat, travel and power our society within 10 years. And we need to plan out exactly what this means at the granularity that can deliver investor confidence. But it's no good Scotland being the Saudi Arabia of this renewables revolution if the kit to power it is being built in Saudi Arabia. There are still issues that need to be resolved in the offshore wind supply chain. Like Richard Leonard, I first visited the Methil yard some time ago, back in 2004, and I remember being handed a tatty photocopied Scottish Enterprise marketing leaflet about the site and the investment potential. And the reality is that the level of Scottish Enterprise investment in simple things, like providing a concreted hard standing and a paint shop, just hasn't happened. Our yards should not be oil and gas museums. They need facilities that are capable of producing at a bigger scale, 24/7, 365 days a year. And the investment at CS Wind in Campbelltown and the doubling of production there should give us the confidence to bash on with the ambitious investment needed in all parts of the renewable sector. Because the role of the courageous state is to make things happen that otherwise would not. And there are so many opportunities that lie ahead. I'll pick one. The UK Climate Change Committee said it was a no-brainer to move the ban on the sale of new fossil cars forward to 2030. And even Michael Gove indicated to me in committee recently that the UK's target date is under review. But are we acting fully on the opportunities that will come from this? Are we focusing on developing the next generation of charging technology here in Scotland? Or what about the vital role that EVs and home battery usage will have in feeding back into the grid during peak demand? There are technologies and energy services to be developed that can spin out of academia, even though venture capital and markets may be cautious to invest in new areas at the beginning. The strategic thinking, the detailed planning and coordination has to come through a Green New Deal for Scotland to maximise all of these opportunities. And the climate emergency demands a level of transformative ambition never seen before. But it must come with hope, a just transition and livelihoods for the workers at BIFAB.
Thank you very much. I now call Willie Rennie. Mr Rennie, please.
Nartnagoch will be 10 miles off the coast of my constituency. And at the other end, we will have the Methil and Burnt Island shipyards. This is important to Fife. It's important to Scotland as well. Now, Andy Kinsella, who was the Chief Executive Officer of Mainstream Renewable Power, who applied for Nartnagoch for the wind farm permission, he said that the contracts for difference, after they were awarded, we can finally focus on delivering the very significant benefits this project brings to the Scottish economy and its environment. Mainstream had an economic breakdown of the project and estimated 500 jobs will be created in the 3-year build phase, and at least £550 million of the total project cost will be spent in the Scottish supply chain. The company also anticipated a further £1.8 billion will be spent operating and maintaining the array over the projected 25-year lifetime, and around 100 roles would be created. They set up the Nartnagoch Coalition, a group of about 60 organisations supporting the development. Alan Duncan, the spokesman for that coalition, said, "This means the only major infrastructure project that is ready to build in Scotland next year can now go ahead, creating 2,000 jobs for each year of its 4-year construction process, as well as hundreds of long-term permanent jobs." Mainstream then went on and commissioned a Fraser of Allender Institute report, which estimated that NNG would contribute 0.6% of GDP, £827 million, to the Scottish economy over the project's lifetime, creating thousands of jobs during the construction phase and over 230 operations and maintenance jobs for the 25-year lifetime of the wind farm. The carrots were dangled. Local people were encouraged to speak up. There was adverts in the local and national newspapers. Local politicians like me were put under pressure. We were courted. Ministers were put under considerable pressure to support the NNG scheme. So now is the time for the new owners to deliver for Scotland. The obligation, the promises made by Mainstream were inherited by EDF. Deliver now as we were promised. If this does not happen, it will be a huge mistake for EDF, but also for the wider industry, because it will send a message very loud and clear that your promises mean absolutely nothing. EDF are now rumoured to be awarding the contract for constructing the jackets for these huge turbines to Sapian, an Italian industrial giant. They would manufacture the jackets in Indonesia, the other side of the planet. The environmental footprint alone of shipping these massive structures, and they are massive, right way around the world would be significant. This is supposed to be an environmental project. Why on earth are we constructing them this far away and committing so much energy to get them here in the first place? Certainly.
Don Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. He talks about EDF, and is he relying on their goodwill in all of this, or does he feel that there should be more pressure put on them? It should be a contractual commitment to do these things?
Yes, I think there should be a contractual commitment, and it's a mistake not to have a contractual commitment. It's been seen in other contracts in other parts of the energy sector. Why on earth it's not being done for this, I simply do not understand. The loss to the local economy would be significant as well. Of course, the yards at Methil need to be upgraded, and investment is required as well. They need to improve efficiency. They need to improve the capacity so they can cope with the demands of this new NNG contract. Change is required to ensure they are ready, not just for this contract, but for other contracts as well in the future. Now, Gary Smith, I think he speaks with great clarity on this issue. Before the latest problem that has occurred, he said this: promises made by politicians a decade ago over Scotland's renewable industries will amount to nothing more than a puddle of snake oil. We don't have a Saudi Arabia of renewables we were promised. And then this is really important. He says the taxpayers pour billions of pounds of subsidies into an industry that lines the pockets of other countries and private financiers instead of redistributing wealth into our own communities. If this happens, if this goes ahead, and if this contract goes abroad, there will be real anger felt in the communities of Fife. The real disconnect is real. Just in a second. How do we make sure that Scotland does not lose out again? I'll take an intervention.
Cabinet Secretary.
If investors and developers currently and planning to invest in Scotland are watching and listening to this debate, would Willie Rennie agree with me that it would be easier, it would make their life easier if they would just invest in Scotland and they wouldn't be getting the berating that they're getting this afternoon?
And you're moving into your last minute, Mr Rennie.
I think that's right. And I think they should listen very carefully. They should not make bold promises, put adverts in newspapers right across Scotland, encourage the support of ordinary working people in their communities to back their plans, then ship the jobs abroad. They should never, ever do that if they want these contracts in the future. So it's a big lesson for them to learn. That's why we support the Fife Ready for Renewal campaign. The work should be awarded to Fife. It should be awarded to Scotland, because that is what we were promised.
Thank you very much. Open debate. I call Claire Baker, who will be followed by Annabel Ewing. Ms Baker, please.
Presiding Officer, thank you. I very much welcome this afternoon's debate. The future of the Fife construction yards in Methil and Ballantyne is very important to me, and I've had a relationship with the workforce and their trade unions since I was elected to my first term in Parliament. My first regional office was in Methil, just along Wellesley Road from the Fife Energy Park, where BIFAB is located. I first visited BIFAB at a time of prosperity for the company with the then MP Lindsay Roy and the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, Ed Miliband. But over the years, I have witnessed the ups and downs of that business, the struggle with the global competitiveness of the renewables manufacturing sector, the tenacity of a company which was determined to compete at a challenging level to secure work for those yards. There have been strongly mounted campaigns over the years, and there have been times when the workforce has been greatly reduced. During this time, I've worked with GMB and Unite members at Methil Scotland should benefit from the growth of the renewable sector. This area, which has a proud history of manufacturing, a strong industrial heritage, a skilled workforce, but is too often hampered by underemployment, by in-work poverty and the lack of opportunity, this is it. The March on Parliament, when BIFAB was on the brink of collapse in November 2017, was a powerful demonstration of the passion and the commitment of the workforce, their families and their community. I recognise the role the Scottish Government played in the company continuing to operate and able to complete their work for the Beatrice contract, which was vitally important for the reputation of the company and the workforce. The rescue package enabled the takeover of the company by DF Barnes, and I very much welcome the positive relationships which are reported by the trade unions with the new owners, and I recognise their commitment to making a success of the business and securing work for the 5 yards. But it is hugely frustrating and damaging for the local economy that the yards are sitting empty. The work that has been secured at Arnish is welcome and demonstrates the ability of the company to gain work, but there is capacity to take more at this yard, and crucially, we need to see employment in the 5 yards. I will briefly mention Scottish Enterprise. BIFAB leased the yard from Scottish Enterprise, and there is a need for investment into the infrastructure of the yard. Over the years, there have been discussions over this, and I understand the commercial relationship there is. But there is an opportunity here to add value, and there is a workforce capable of delivering the yard improvements if the Scottish Government, through Scottish Enterprise, would commission work. I recognise the recent summit that was held by the Scottish Government and the roundtable held by the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee. Our motion today calls on the Scottish and the UK governments to review the contracts for difference and supply chain process as part of the offshore wind sector deal, to ensure that it will bring significant work to the 5 yards during the construction phase of all projects. Concerns have been raised over the weaknesses of the deal. If the deal is to deliver, not just for reducing emissions, but also for our communities, it needs to set conditions to secure work in the UK, and in particular supporting the Scottish market, where we are seeing growth and a pipeline of projects.
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, I make the point that CFD is reserved to Westminster. Consenting is, for us, we can't attach conditionality consenting, but conditionality could be attached to CFD. That might come at some cost, but that would be welcome for Scottish investment. Would the Labour Party then join with us in calling upon the UK Government to allow that conditionality on contract for difference, which could be absolutely pivotal in ensuring work for Scotland?
Claire Baker.
I do accept the points made by the Cabinet Secretary and recognise the role of the UK Government in this, but the summit that you held did bring together the UK Government with the Scottish Government. I'd ask the Scottish Government to apply any pressure they can to make this a better sector for the Scottish companies to compete within. So I think we need to show greater ambition for expansion in the sector and ensure that our skilled manufacturing base can see the benefit of this. We cannot continue to see companies taking advantage of Scotland's natural resources but not investing into the people of Scotland and our communities. The Economy Committee's session outlined the problems that are being faced by BIFAB, competing in what is often described as a tangled mess of contracts and payments. Witnesses were clear about their concerns over the abuse of state aid rules and the lack of a level playing field. Serious questions were asked about the status of consent letters from Marine Scotland and the subsequent failure to see the conditions which were described as expected and likely to be realised. And as the Government have explained, the Crown Estate devolution powers presents us with opportunities, and we need to make the best use of those. Presiding Officer, the bitter disappointment of losing out on the Kincardine and Moray contracts mean the yards in Fife are lying unused. Workers have not been in the yard for a year, yards which have been mothballed and become a symbol of missed opportunity and stilled potential. But that has not dampened the commitment of the workforce and their trade unions. The launch of the Fife Ready for Renewal campaign deserves the support of all of us. The idea that EDF will award the contracts for wind turbine jackets for the NNG offshore wind farm, sitting off the coast of Fife to Indonesia, to then be shipped thousands of miles to Scotland, is just not acceptable. That people in Fife will see this farm from their windows but get none of the economic benefit while they are paying into the project is completely unacceptable. I am urging EDF to do the right thing, to honour commitments they have given to local investment, to support the Scottish industry, and in return they will receive a highly skilled, committed workforce and be able to demonstrate a commitment to reducing our carbon footprint and prove their green credentials. There is a significant majority in Parliament to recognise that around the globe we are facing a climate emergency, and we in Scotland have an important role to play in tackling climate change. Changing our economy and reducing our use of oil and fossil fuel is critical to this. We support a zero-carbon economy, and our renewable output is a huge factor in achieving this. But our communities and our workforce have not been feeling the benefit of that transition. When the Fife Energy Park opened, there was optimism and promises of future, well-paid, highly skilled jobs that would re-energise Leavenmouth and Fife. As the STUC report, Broken Promises shows, less than a third of the jobs that were promised in Scotland have been delivered. This is a poor legacy for the industry so far. We need to all take responsibility for doing business differently, and EDF could take a lead on this and ensure that these valuable green jobs come to Fife. I urge them to do so.
Thank you very much. I now call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Alexander Burnett. Ms Ewing, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm pleased to have been called to speak in this important debate this afternoon. And at the outset, I would wish to say, as the MSP for Cowdenbeath constituency, that I am 100% behind the BIFAB workers whose skills are second to none. And I'm also very pleased to note that the Scottish Government has once again reiterated its commitment to stand by BIFAB and to strain every sinew to secure a long-term future for the Yards. And indeed, Presiding Officer, in addition, of course, to the extraordinarily impressive fight by the BIFAB workers themselves, it is precisely because of the intervention by the Scottish Government that BIFAB still exists. For Presiding Officer, I would submit that the Scottish Government is no mere bystander as far as workers are concerned, and indeed has the backs of workers in Scotland. And whereas the UK Government is now entirely engulfed in its Brexit chaos and Tory party leadership machinations, fortunately, we in Scotland have a government that is getting on with the job. And the job that it is doing in connection with BIFAB is to fight for this work, to fight for these jobs and to fight for this growing industry in Scotland. And in this context, the recently launched BIFAB campaign entitled Fife Ready for Renewal, launched by the GMB Unite and the STUC as a whole, is to be applauded, for it is vital that supply chain work comes to BIFAB. And of key importance in this regard, in the short to medium term future, as has been mentioned, is the EDF NNG offshore wind farm to be located just 10 miles off the Fife coast. And it would surely be as nonsensical as it would be an absolute travesty if BIFAB did not receive the work for the wind turbine jackets for this significant infrastructure project. And indeed, much has been made of the environmental costs of transporting the jackets from Indonesia, rumoured to be in the mix with the contract, back to 10 miles off the Fife coast. Surely these environmental costs must be factored in to the overall total cost of the project over its lifetime. And I wrote last week to the Chief Executive of EDF making these very points, and I also stressed that the BIFAB yards at Methil and Ballantyne were ready and able to take on the work, and I also highlighted the importance of that work for the Fife economy. I also took this up with the Cabinet Secretary, for it is in my mind imperative that people in Scotland actually see the maximum benefit from the new generation of renewable energy technologies that are now coming on stream. And it cannot be the case that we miss out on what should be a major boost for, in the case of the NNG project, the Fife economy, and for other contracts for Scotland as a whole. And it is certainly the case that the supply chain must work hard to seek opportunities by, for example, making strategic investments and considering appropriate collaborations when putting in tenders for contracts. And I am pleased to note that the Scottish Government is committed to maximising the sector, and that its recently convened special summit involving key developers and suppliers was also a success. It is a pity that the UK Government Energy Minister was not able to attend, but I know that the trade unions were there. I understand the industry has agreed that collective action is needed to ensure supply chain companies are well positioned to benefit from upcoming offshore wind projects. And also, I understand that industry accepts that a bit of a sea change is needed in order to meet the ambitious 60% local content targets that the UK Government has set in its offshore wind sector deal. But on that key point, of course, and it's a very pertinent question that the Cabinet Secretary has posed both to the Conservatives and to the Labour Party, without conditionality in the contract for difference process, how on earth are we going to get these large companies to do this? This is not a game we're playing. These are people's livelihoods. We must have conditionality in this process. It is nonsensical not to have this. And I'm disappointed in particular that the Tories have just disregarded that proposition. As far as the Scottish Government is concerned, it is absolutely essential that they continue to work with the trade unions and others, and of course the UK Government, to ensure that Scotland does get our fair share of the renewables manufacturing bonanza that we do all wish to see. And I understand that whilst the UK Government is to, further to that summit, have a look again at the contract for difference and supply chain process, as I say, it is essential that conditionality is ensured. And indeed, it is such a pity that this Parliament does not have that power, because what a difference we could make to really driving this industry forward. I commend the unstinting efforts of the GMB, Unite and the SUC, and I also commend the BIFAB workers themselves, whose skills, commitment and indeed impressive dignity are, I would argue, the best adverts for the future of the yard. This contract is vital for the workers, for the company and for Fife. And I know that the Scottish Government will continue to do everything it can to secure this work. And I welcome the CAP6 pledge to that effect, stated again this afternoon. Presiding Officer, today our Parliament here in Scotland is sending a message, a strong message. EDF, honour the promises made and bring this vital work to Fife. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call Alexander Burnett to be followed by Alec Neil. Mr Burnett, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I note members to my register of interest in renewable energy and manufacturing. So, considering the SNP recently announced that they are stepping up their action to combat climate change, I'm sure that the Scottish Government will be keen to implement actions that support our renewable energy sector as much as possible. And so I welcome the opportunity to talk in this debate today to promoting our offshore wind sector and the importance our renewable energy industry has to contribute towards the Scottish and UK economy. Because it is important that skilled workers like those at BIFAB are employed so that we can boost our local economy and, importantly, retain skilled workers in Scotland. However, disappointingly, the SNP government is still dragging their feet, and whilst they will tell every media release that they intend to invest in climate change and our renewable industry, the action is lacking. And just looking at the fuel poverty and climate change bill shows that both are simply not going far enough in their ambitions. And in the case, no, I think we've heard enough from the SNP today about their priorities. And in the case of the Fife Ready for Renewal campaign, we cannot escape the fact that constructing parts for Scotland's offshore wind farms halfway around the world and transporting them here has a carbon cost. And transport emissions are barely falling and made up a third of Scotland's overall emissions in 2016. But we need to take bigger steps by ensuring local companies are awarded contracts to reduce our impact on the climate. And not only that, we need to help boost our local economy and provide jobs for skilled workers. And the sector has shrunk every quarter for the past 2 years, the last quarter alone shrinking by 3.5%, the largest fall on record. And I spoke in a debate last year on Apprenticeship Week, where I noted the importance to encourage people...
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm chairing the meeting.
As we will soon reach a shortage of workers, with more than half of those in the industry reaching retirement age. Now, as we will hear from many members today, this is about more than just one firm. It's about the wider environment for businesses and how we need to be better in supporting that. Now, Scottish Renewables noted that offshore wind expansion will provide huge potential for hundreds of supply chain companies, ports and communities, which all feed into these offshore projects. And the offshore wind sector is one to be very excited about for Scotland and the UK, and is likely to reach an expected target of 50% UK content by 2020. And with it currently at 48% of UK content, a 5% increase on 2012, it shows it is moving in the right direction. And earlier this year, the UK Energy Minister announced the offshore wind sector deal, which will further reduce emissions and protect the environment. So this is a landmark agreement between the UK government and offshore wind sector, with suggestions that the UK could reach 30 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. And this will, yes. Yeah.
Alec Rowley.
For Mr Burnett taking an intervention. There are workers upstairs in the gallery today who have been competing against companies, state-owned companies for overseas. There's not a level playing field, and there is a view that whilst they have been trying, the UK government has been sitting on its hands. Will he push the UK government to intervene, to put the resources in and to create a level playing field?
Mr Burnett.
Thank you. I think we're all aware that there are state aid restrictions on investment, and maybe after Brexit there'll be opportunities. And maybe after Brexit there will be opportunities to give support.
Cabinet Secretary, passion, yes. Excuse me, please sit down. Just warning you to keep a lid on it a bit. Thank you very much. Mr Burnett.
So not only will we see investment of up to £250 million in building a stronger UK supply chain, but also social equality commitments, such as increasing the representation of women to at least a third. And with an expected increase in the number of green jobs in the industry from 7,000 today to 27,000 by 2030, this is a great deal for the UK. And importantly, a significant number of these jobs are expected to be in Scotland. So we need the SNP to show their commitment to the renewable energy sector, to support businesses like BiFab to gain contracts, to encourage companies like EDF to recognise their environmental impact, and to take bigger steps in their ambitions to combat climate change in Scotland. Because Scotland currently has the lowest economic growth of any country in the EU, the lowest jobs growth of any region or nation in the UK, and there has been no improvement on our productivity levels since 2007. So we as a country have so much to offer, but right now we are not showing it. However, we have the tools to make these statistics change, and I truly believe Scotland can be back on top. Now, thanks to the UK government, Scotland's budget is increasing by £521 million in real terms in 1920, with the block grant rising by 1.7%. So there can be no excuse that the SNP doesn't have the resources to help. So to the SNP government, I say invest in our climate change economy and use this extra cash to stick to your commitment to maintain Scotland's reputation as a global leader on tackling climate change. So I'm disappointed but not surprised that so far it has been all talk but no action. But I hope that they are determined to tackle the climate emergency our generation faces, and we can work together to achieve ambitious climate change targets. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Alec Neil, who will be followed by Alec Rowley. Mr Neil, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't want to get involved in party politics on this, but I have to say the speeches from the Tory benches have been absolutely appalling this afternoon and show absolutely no commitment to Scotland whatsoever. And, Presiding Officer, I'm not taking any interventions from the Tory benches. Presiding Officer, yet again, here we are in Scotland, having to beg multinational companies to get some control over our own resources. This is not the first time we've been here. In terms of the North Sea, 30 and 40 years ago, we again were in the same situation with North Sea oil, where the Scottish people did not benefit from the great wealth from the oil in the North Sea. Not just in terms of the revenue, but in terms of the jobs, in terms of the technology, in terms of the order book. We never, ever got our fair share. And to be fair to the Labour government of Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan, they tried to rectify that by creating an offshore supplies office and the British National Oil Corporation. Not to go and beg, but actually to take ownership of our resource and turn it into a wealth creation for Scotland and indeed other parts of the United Kingdom. And what was one of the first things the Thatcher government did when they came to power? They sold off BNOC and they get rid of the Offshore Supplies Office, and the consequence of that is that we've never realised our full potential from oil. And here we are again, history repeating itself, where this massive asset in the North Sea, as the Cabinet Secretary said, with huge potential for wind power generation. And we are not reaping the benefit of that because we don't have the power to impose conditionality. If this Parliament had the power, we would have a clear majority to impose conditionality, and that would almost solve the BiFab problem overnight. But we don't have that power. So we've got to look at other ways until we get the power of addressing this situation. And that falls into two categories. First of all, we have got to fight, ideally on a united front, for the BIFAB workers and their families. And if that means in the meantime we have to beg EDF, we have to beg them. We have to persuade them. We have to try to get the Energy Minister in London to exercise her power, as well as us maximise the use of our power. And I think we should do all of that, and I think at least most of us in this chamber are agreed with this. But the second thing we have to do in this chamber is to make sure that Scotland never gets into this position again. And if you look back at our history, if you look at hydropower, the huge resource concentrated in the north of Scotland, as Mark Ruskell said, we didn't wait for some EDF from another country to come along to manage and develop our hydro resource. We did it. Tom Johnson set up the North of Scotland Hydro Electricity Board during the war, at the most difficult time to get the money to do it. So I say to the Scottish Government, if we're not going to get the powers we need, then let us look at repeating the model of the Hydro Board. Set up a Scottish National Renewable Energy Company and get it not just to bid for contracts from big multinationals, but actually to develop the wind farms onshore and offshore and take control of the whole process and use that power to buy in the resources of BIFAB, to give BIFAB and other Scottish companies their orders, to build up an export industry in wind farm development in terms of the technology and all the rest of it. Mobilise our resources. We have vast pension funds in the public sector in Scotland. Get them to invest in that kind of dynamic process in a new company, a national company, to manage, own and develop our wind power capability. Then we don't need to go and beg. And the other thing we should do, and I would suggest to the Government, in addition to all the excellent work the Scottish Government has already done in relation to BIFAB and the general development of renewables, in addition to that, review every power. Review your planning powers. Review your legislation in relation to emission controls. Review your environmental powers. Review your financial powers to look at every possible way in the meantime to secure the work for BIFAB, but in the longer term to make sure that we are never treated like this ever again. Our people are entitled to benefit from our own natural resources. Let us unite behind a practical programme to make that happen.
Thank you. I call Alec Rowley, to be followed by David Torrance. Mr Rowley, please.
I would have to agree with the majority of what Comrade Neil had to say. For, as the windiest country in Europe, we should be angry and embarrassed that every single turbine around us has been imported. Those are the words of the former UK Energy Minister, Brian Wilson, and he is right. We should be angry that we have empty yards here in Scotland, yards that are very able to produce and deliver the platforms of offshore renewable projects being built off the coast of Scotland. Yet we have seen contracts to provide those platforms being placed with companies in Belgium, in Spain and in the United Arab Emirates, whilst Scottish yards lie empty and Scottish workers struggle to find jobs. Unite and the GMB simply say they want a level playing field. The trades unions, both Unite and the GMB, have previously criticised the failure to deliver renewable supply chain benefits to the Scottish yards and Scottish workers. They have said the jobs of the future that are critical to delivering the green energy revolution and a sustainable planet are being carved up by big business who don't care about Scottish workers, don't care about Scottish communities and don't care about Scotland's future. And they are right. That is why this Parliament must unite behind ensuring that the next big Scottish renewable project, an offshore wind farm worth a staggering £2 billion located less than 10 miles from the coast of Fife, brings the jobs to Scotland, brings the jobs to Fife. It would seem, as others have said, that the owners of this site, EDF, the French state-owned energy company, have a preference to award the contract to build the platforms at the other side of the world in Indonesia. This would seem to be madness, given, as Richard Leonard has pointed out again and again, it is estimated that bringing these structures from Indonesia would take over 300 journeys and could generate emissions the equivalent of 35 million cars on the road. Surely this makes a mockery of any claims to be focused on tackling the climate emergency. And this hypocrisy must not only be exposed, but it must be brought to an end. We cannot have a situation where workers are told that they have to pay the price for a greener climate, whilst the speculators, the multinationals and the state-owned foreign companies rake in the profits. So let us be clear. Scottish firms are not benefiting fully from the opportunities available in the renewable energy sector, as was shown, and as Richard Leonard said, in the report from the STUC, Broken Promises. That report highlighted that fewer than a third of the jobs that were promised in Scotland's renewable energy sector have been delivered. The trades unions are working with communities in Fife and across Scotland, and the message is clear. We have our own better plan for EDF, one that works for Fife, for Scotland and for the planet. It is really simple. Build these turbine jackets in Fife. The yards here are ready and waiting to get started on work that could create jobs for over 1,000 people, unlocking much-needed investment and growth in our future. This would be good news for local communities, and it would be good news for our economy. And if the bulk of the wind turbine jackets are built in yards just 10 miles from the wind farm, it would mean less shipping and significantly less carbon emissions over the lifespan of this project. That's more good news for our environment and for the future of our planet. Fife is ready for renewal, and the NNG project is the opportunity that we need. We have the yards, we have the skills, and we have the communities ready to play their part in tackling the climate emergency. EDF must think again and do what is right for Fife, what is right for Scotland, and what is right for our environment. And to all the parties in this Parliament, I would say what we need is a proper manufacturing strategy for Scotland, where the state plays a key role in securing the aims we supposedly agree upon, a just transition. There is no reason we cannot have a local and regional benefits agreement model in place for the Scottish energy sector, like they do in Canada, and even here in Scotland through the community benefit clauses and local government procurement contracts. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would quite simply like to reiterate that the plan put forward by Unite and the GMB, a plan that helps secure jobs in Fife and in Scotland and is better for our planet, is the right plan that this Parliament should support. Build these new turbine jackets in Fife. Let's find a way to properly jumpstart the renewable supply chain in Scotland and reap the benefits for a new generation of a new green industrial revolution.
Thank you. I call David Torrance to be followed by Bill Bowman. Mr Torrance, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome today's motion by the Labour Party this afternoon, asking that Parliament support the Scottish Trade Union Congress Vice Ready for Renewal campaign, and I am fully supportive of that campaign. Presiding Officer, I also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to BIFAB this afternoon and the support that the Scottish Government has given and will continue to give to both the company's Mephill and Ballantyne yards, which are within my constituency. The Ready for a Renewal campaign highlights the benefits of securing contracts in the renewable sector, which would have on BIFAB, its staff, the local communities of Mephill and Ballantyne. I would like to thank the Scottish Trade Union Congress, Unite and the GMB for the continued work with the Scottish Government and BIFAB's owners, Canadian fabrication company DF Barnes, to help secure the future of the BIFAB yards. Their continued message of positivity through difficult times for the company and its workforce has helped keep momentum and focus on the Fife fabrication sector. The need for new contracts to revitalise these yards has been felt deeply across my constituency and has impacted on the local economy in the area greatly, particularly in the community around BIFAB's Mephill yard, where 41% of the individuals live in one of the most 20% of the most deprived areas in Scotland. This is more than double the figure for Fife as a whole. The yard is vital to creating local employment and providing employees with highly sought-after skills. But more importantly, by bringing local young people into modern apprenticeship schemes and a skill sector that is transferable to engineering sectors across Scotland and even the global manufacturing industry. I have visited the yard on a number of occasions over the course of my term in office, and I have learned firsthand from employees of these yards the importance of this employer to the local area and the difference that employment in the highly skilled and well-paid positions make to the lives of those living in an area of multiple deprivation. The sooner that BIFAB's 1,200-strong workforce can return to the yards in Mephill and Ballantyne, the better. The knock-on effect and the lack of contracts also affects many local businesses that serve the yards, from suppliers and transportation services to local accommodation and plant hire. These businesses have all missed out on revenue due to a lack of contracts and employment. Renewable projects like the £2 billion NNG offshore wind farm, which once constructed will generate enough energy power a year for the whole of Edinburgh, only adds to manufacturing an important role that the Scottish economy and contracts like NNG wind farm would ensure and continue to support and enhance the Scottish manufacturing and fabrication sector. This in turn would create highly skilled jobs and would boost both the local area economy and the Scottish economy as a whole. Scotland is a world leader in renewable energy and we have the most ambitious emission reduction targets of any other nation. How can we expect them to compete with companies? Oh, sorry, Presiding Officer, turned over too many pages. But there is no sense of striving for greatness in these areas and not capitalising on the opportunities they create. They have a potential to benefit the entire Scottish manufacturing supply chain, breathe life back into yards like BIFAB, and give hope back to communities that they support. The Scottish Government, along with the UK Government, must use all of its powers available to maximise the ability of Scottish companies like BIFAB to benefit from contracts being awarded in the renewable sectors. My question many of my constituents ask me, why is BIFAB not winning contracts? Well, the answer is a simple one. How can we expect a company to compete with companies such as Navanacia, who are allowed to run up losses by their Spanish government owners, and can therefore offer prices far below what a Scottish company who strives to, at the very least, break even by producing high-quality work carried out by well-paid employees? We cannot expect BIFAB to tender and win contracts when they are not competing on a level playing field. The Scottish Government's strong support for BIFAB is the reason we are able to debate this topic today. Without the Government's intervention in the company and the commitment to BIFAB's sustainability, there would not be the same hope or future for a company that there is today. By becoming a minority shareholder, the Government brought the company back from the brink of closure. Additional investment from the well-established DF Barnes has revitalised the vision for the Ballantyne and Mephill yards to maintain consistent contracts and become a stable employer they once were. The First Minister has personally visited the yard and the people on the ground fighting to keep the fabrication industry alive. The Government have repeatedly demonstrated their commitment to the yards, and I, as well as a large number of my constituents, appreciate this continued support. I am aware that investment that Scottish Enterprise has put into Mephill Yard to modernise it and update the facilities to keep up with demands of modern fabrication. What BIFAB needs now is for that support to result in new opportunities for fabrication and construction in the marine, renewable and energy sector in Scotland, not only because it is in the Scottish taxpayers' best interest, but because the people of Mephill and Ballantyne desperately need the moral boost and of the newly awarded contract will bring. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Scottish manufacturing supply chain must see a benefit of a government's commitment to renewable energy and emissions reductions, and the billions of pounds worth of contracts that this commitment will bring. The sector's highly skilled workforce must be given the opportunity to contribute to that cause and benefit from creating a better, more sustainable Scotland. Employment for the renewable sector will not only benefit Bifab yards in Methil and Ballantyne, but a wider manufacturing and fabrication sector across Scotland. Presiding Officer, EDF Energy have a moral duty to support the Scottish supply chain and grant the economic benefit of production of an LNG wind farm to the very area that it will call home. After all, once the LNG wind farm is completed, EDF will make billions of pounds worth of profit over the course of the site's lifespan. I believe it would be a shameful mark on Scotland's industrial history if Bifab received no work as a result of the country's commitment to carbon neutrality and investment in renewable energy.
Thank you very much. I call Bill Bowman to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Mr Bowman, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I refer to my register of interest via fund with Energy Industry Holdings? Today's debate comes as Scotland builds its renewable energy in on and offshore wind, solar and hydropower. Many of these energy initiatives are realised through competitive international contracts, and it is through a spirit of collaboration that the industry has seen huge development over the years. However, our economy is struggling. The Government's labour productivity statistics show that Scotland has not improved its productivity on global league tables since 2007, and our growth is forecast to be slower than the UK as a whole from 2020 up to 2023. Add to this the threat to Bifab in Fife, and you could be forgiven for thinking that this is simply another example of a sector trying to grow under tough economic conditions. However, the Parliament was made aware last week that less than a third of the jobs that were promised by this SNP government in Scotland's renewable energy sector have been delivered. Nonetheless, Scotland's renewable energy sector has strong support from a number of industries and corporate bodies who are committed to seeing this country continue to lead the way in creating a greener and more energy-efficient world. Scotland's growing capacity for renewables has translated into a significant increase in renewable electricity output, which has more than tripled from 2007 to 2018. Turnover from renewable energy activity in 2017 was about 5.5 billion, and perhaps more significantly, the renewable energy sector accounts for 17,000 jobs across Scotland. This growth is supported by industry bodies, including Scottish Renewables, and initiatives such as the offshore wind sector deal implemented by the UK Government. This deal pledges to drive the transformation of offshore wind generation, boosting the productivity and competitiveness of the UK supply chain. Despite the Scottish Government's pledge to help our renewable energy sector grow...
Cabinet Secretary.
Could Mr Bowman, who I appreciate taking the intervention, name a single legal measure that we could have taken, that we haven't taken, that would have secured work for Bifab or any other yard?
Bill Bowman.
I think proving negatives is a difficult exercise. I think what the issue is, you have to work with the UK Government to find the areas where you can implement these measures. We are seeing the consequences of a lack of structural investment in industry foresight, which leaves our Scottish renewable industries at a disadvantage compared to European competitors. Furthermore, Presiding Officer, it's not just the workforce who are affected. Local businesses feel the squeeze too, which makes the example of Bifab about more than just one firm. It's about the wider environment for businesses and this SNP government's failing approach to the economy. The example of Bifab is depressing on many fronts. The overlooked yards are a devastating situation for the local economy. They are ready and waiting to get started on work that could create jobs for over 1,000 people, unlocking much-needed investment and growth for the region's future. This Parliament shares the concerns of the STUC, who understand that little of the work of fabricating jackets for wind turbines will come to Fife. It is encouraging to see the efforts of Scottish Enterprise, who have invested in hard-standing infrastructure and piling works at the Fife quayside, and GMB Scotland and Unite, who have launched the Ready for Renewal campaign. These efforts will help ensure that construction of parts for Scotland's offshore wind farms do not happen halfway around the world. Presiding Officer, our renewable energy sector is crying out for help to fulfil the demands that we place on it. Feedback given to the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee highlighted a lack of industrial strategy for offshore wind and more broadly for the whole renewables sector.
It is crucial that we start to grow our economy and put infrastructure in place to allow the renewable energy sector to reach its potential. However, this can only be achieved through a change in mindset. The motion focuses on Fife, but the offshore wind farms are in range of the Forth and Tay ports. In my region, Dundee and Montrose have the credentials to be considered for oil and gas decommissioning work and the construction and maintenance of these wind farms. We need to include such facilities in a joined-up approach to supply chain management. Dundee's council leader last year said he hoped to bring £1.8 billion investment to the city to build 54 turbines. However, the First Minister admitted to the STUC conference last month that this government had not been as successful in winning contracts as it had hoped. It's a long time since the Tay was home to many of the finest wood, iron and steel shipbuilding workshops in the world. But the strategic position of Dundee, along with the need for high-quality construction jobs in the wake of difficulties elsewhere, makes it an ideal place to build and decommission renewables. We want to see Scotland at the forefront of new jobs in renewables, but the SNP's government's muddled approach to supporting businesses put that at risk. We in the Conservative benches are proud to be part of a UK which is reducing emissions faster than any other G20 country, by 29% in the last decade alone. Presiding Officer, Scotland was once the workshop of the world. With more involved direction and financial support, we can continue to lead the way as a renewable energy innovator of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Lewis MacDonald. Mr McMillan, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I start by offering my support from everyone in Inverclyde to our friends in Fife, that we wholeheartedly support the campaign to actually get this work and get these jobs in Fife. It's so important. It's so important actually for Scotland's industrial strategy. It's so important for Scotland's industrial future as well. Now, I'm saying this because in my community in the Greenock and Inverclyde constituency, we've went through a huge amount of change over the years, as colleagues will know. And certainly in 2014, Ferguson Shipbuilders in Port Glasgow closed down. And it was because of the support of the Scottish Government that actually brought that shipyard back to life. And I know that talking to people in my constituency who absolutely understand the importance of manufacturing manufacturing for Scotland's economy, but also for manufacturing for Scotland's future. Now, part of the motion in front of us from the Labour Party highlights the aspect regarding the emissions being generated by transporting the final product potentially from Indonesia to 10 miles off the coast of Fife. Now, that's actually a similar situation that's been raised by the heritage rail sector in the UK as well. Now, very much, and I admit, very much on a smaller scale, because coal is shipped from Colombia over to the UK to actually go into that particular sector. Now, thankfully, there's a reduced level of coal that's actually been shipped because the sector themselves are reducing the amount of coal that's been used in their particular rail engines. But it's a similar idea. It's a similar situation. But so I just can't understand this whole aspect of potentially shipping these jackets over to Scotland, because the emissions generated certainly just flies in the face of what the final product, what these turbines are actually supposed to be doing in terms of actually helping the environment. A second point I want to touch upon. Richard Leonard spoke in his comments earlier on regarding he wants an interventionist state. Now, if it wasn't for the Scottish Government, then Ferguson Shipbuilders in 2014 would not have come back into being. Then Liberty Steel would not be operating in Lanarkshire. And I just think that there have been many examples of actually where, just one moment if I may, that there have been many examples of actually where the Scottish Government actually have helped to either bring an industry back or to save an industry. And one other just in my constituency before I'll let you in, Mr Leonard, and that's in Texas Instruments in Greenock in my constituency. And that was through a task force that was set up, joint working between the Scottish Government and Inverclyde Council that actually helped bring some type of solution to that particular issue.
Richard Leonard.
I thank the member for taking an intervention, and we applaud the defensive rescues which have been mounted by the Scottish Government in steel, Ferguson's, aluminium and so on. But does he accept that there is a need for a proactive, forward-looking industrial strategy which isn't simply defensive and reactive, but which is proactive?
Stuart McMillan.
Well, that's exactly one of the things the Scottish Government actually has been doing in recent years. Planning ahead. I mean, it was an announcement actually, I don't know if Mr Leonard saw this earlier on, and we're actually on the same page in this, we don't have to fight in this. It was the announcement regarding the Advancing Manufacturing Challenge Fund, a £40 million fund, and that's money is from the, supported by the European Regional Development Fund. So the Scottish Government actually are doing what Mr Leonard is actually asking them to do. Another point I want to touch upon, it was Dean Lockhart and Bill Bowman. I genuinely was disappointed by their contributions. Now, if that was them attempting to have a Team Scotland approach, then I don't know what they're like actually when they're trying to be oppositionist. I mean, it generally was, hold on one moment, it generally was really surprising because, I mean, at the very outset, Mr Lockhart stated that his party was going to support the motion and the amendment by the Scottish Government. But then they go on just to actually thank the Scottish Government and their contributions. And that genuinely was really disappointing because, I mean, to me, as someone who grew up in Port Glasgow, someone who actually witnessed the decline of the shipbuilding industry and of the industrial, most of the industrial industry in my community as a child, and someone who was affected by it, like many other thousands of kids in my community, it really was disgusting to hear some of the comments, and I'll take Mr Lockhart's intervention.
Oh, you're in your last minutes. This will be a short intervention.
Very, very quickly, just to clarify, most of our comments were based on the GMB report called Broken Promises and Offshore Jobs. They weren't comments from us, they were reflecting stakeholders' views on the failures of the Scottish Government in the renewable sector.
Mr McMillan.
Thank you. Once again, selective comments from the Conservative Party. Very much selective comments from the Conservative Party. But I am conscious of time, Presiding Officer. But generally, I know that I speak for my community, that my community and my constituents will want this work to come to Fife. Because it's a good thing for Fife, it's a good thing for Scotland, and it's certainly a good thing for Scotland's industrial future. And that's something that I'm sure that every single person, even the Tories, should actually agree on today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I call Lewis MacDonald to be followed by Gillian Martin. Mr MacDonald, please.
Thank you very much. Níosh na gaidh, the power of the wind could stand for more than just a way of generating electricity. It could become a symbol of energy transition too, if the operators of the wind farm in the Firth of Forth chose to make it so. Those operators are EDF, Électricité de France, as we have heard, a state enterprise from another European country, and like Equinor from Norway and Vattenfall from Sweden, now playing a major role in offshore wind here in Scotland. Of course, Níosh na gaidh is not the only interest of EDF in Scottish renewables. The company has onshore wind farms in operation from Sutherland to Galloway, among a total of 35 sites across the UK. In the Isle of Lewis, EDF has developed plans for major onshore wind farms, one taken forward with the community landowner Stornoway Trust through Lewis Wind Power, and Ushinish now being taken forward by the owners of the Ishkin estate. Lewis Wind Power applied only last week for a new consent for the Stornoway wind farm, precisely in order to make it more able to compete with offshore wind farms like Níosh na gaidh in the North Sea. And the Isle of Lewis is particularly relevant here for two reasons. First, the planned site of the Stornoway wind farm is a near neighbour of the Arnish fabrication yard operated by BIFAB, and so EDF is already well aware of BIFAB from a Lewis as well as a Fife perspective. Secondly, the success of Lewis Wind Power and all other renewable developers in the islands depends on being able to sell power to customers right across the British mainland, which is only going to happen when Lewis is connected to the GB national grid. I met EDF last year to discuss the strategic importance of islands wind in meeting renewable energy targets for Scotland, for the UK and for the European Union. I have made representations to Ofgem on behalf of Scottish Labour, and I know the Scottish Government and others have done precisely the same. We all agree that the regulator Ofgem needs to be more ambitious in supporting renewable energy development in the Western Isles, and it needs to endorse plans for an interconnector from Lewis to the mainland, which can carry 600 megawatts rather than just 450 megawatts of renewable electricity. Now, we have argued for a larger capacity interconnector because we want to stimulate and encourage more renewable energy in the islands, not just large-scale onshore wind, but potentially wave energy and community renewables as well. EDF want that too. Of course, they also have a commercial interest in securing the means for carrying future additional power to the mainland. There's nothing wrong with that commercial interest, but allying commercial interests with policy objectives cannot be a one-way street. EDF is itself a state-owned enterprise. It wants to work with governments and political parties on taking forward policy objectives which converge with their own commercial interests. Well, that's fine, but they also need to use their commercial clout in support of wider policy objectives which will benefit the renewable energy sector as a whole. That is what we are calling on EDF and other renewable energy developers to do today. As the STUC put it last week, a company which has benefited from development consents and which seeks political support on policy issues also needs to be a company that does the right thing. And the right thing in this context is to maximise the economic benefits of renewable energy by placing major fabrication contracts with Scottish yards. And in the case of Niars na Gaidh, that means the BIFAB yards at Methil and Burnt Island. As Richard Leonard reminded us, Burnt Island fabricators in Fife and Lewis offshore at Arnish have been major suppliers over many years of infrastructure offshore for the oil and gas industry. Those days are gone. And when Lewis offshore ran out of work, it was bought out by BIFAB. And when BIFAB ran into trouble, it was bought out by DF Barnes. DF Barnes are also a company with years of experience in oil and gas fabrication in Atlantic Canada and elsewhere, which has made a conscious decision to diversify here in Europe into offshore renewables. That is a choice which deserves support. And even more than the company, the workers at BIFAB deserve support, not just from government, but also from the renewables energy sector itself. And that is to start with EDF at Niars na Gaidh and with Tier 1 contractors like Saipem, who have also been mentioned today. It is difficult to see how transporting offshore production jackets from East Asia to the Firth of Forth could be more profitable than fabrication here in Scotland, unless the terms and conditions of the workers in Indonesia are truly dire and workplace safety non-existent. That can hardly be the right thing to do. If production in East Asia on that basis really is price competitive, that will only undermine other fabrication yards which do the right thing, not just in Britain, but across the European Union. And I hope ministers are seeking to cooperate on these issues, not just with the UK government, but also with the EU, because there is an interest in keeping out or in preventing the undermining of commonly accepted working conditions. Ministers in the Scottish and UK governments have real clout in their relationships with offshore wind developers as licensing authorities inshore and offshore, and I was pleased to hear much of what Derek Mackay had to say. Governments need to work together in order to develop a shared strategy for offshore wind, which requires not just warm words about local content, but actual delivery. And if ministers in both governments, in spite of some of the things we've heard today, can take a joined-up approach, and if EDF, as a result, choose to do the right thing, then Niars na Gaidh can also be Niars Erson Ma, the power of the wind and a force for good as well.
Thank you very much, Ms MacDonald. I call Gillian Martin, who followed by Alexander Stewart. Ms Martin, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland is a country of engineering and innovation. The engineering and manufacturing past for Scotland was the bedrock of employment for generations of people. From the bridges we've built all over the world, to the ships built which have sailed all over the world, to the oil and gas platforms that give so much work to the people in my constituency and beyond, and have engendered the experience we've exported all over the world. Now we're on the next wave of engineering and innovation with a pressing need to create more renewable energy. It's estimated that as we address the climate emergency, we'll need to stop burning hydrocarbons and heat our homes and power our transport with clean energy. So the demand for clean electricity will double at least, and we're committed to that power coming from renewables. I fully support the Fife Ready for Renewal campaign, and I fully agree with the calls for the manufacturing work associated with that to be produced in the Inchcape and Seagreen offshore wind farms to be won by local firms like Bifab. Of course, my constituency has the Aberdeen offshore wind farm, which is currently producing enough clean electricity to power hundreds of thousands of homes. I think it's 70% of the needs of Aberdeen City every day. But it's been well documented that the wind turbines and subsea structures that make up the wind farm were produced elsewhere. It would be a great shame if the workers and people of Fife were to find themselves unable to benefit directly from the projects off their coastline as well. And I wholeheartedly agree that the import of hardware from across the world is completely at odds with our efforts to reduce the very emissions we want to avoid as we move towards a low-carbon future powered by that hardware. We should be doing everything in our power to squeeze every last drop of economic activity out of large infrastructure projects for local workforces. And where we don't have the power, we should be campaigning together to get it devolved to this Parliament, and in the meantime, working together to get the UK Government to do the right thing. And I'm delighted to hear that the Scottish Government is going to use the powers that are now in place with the recently passed Crown Estate Bill to incentivise the supply chain for such projects to be in Scotland. But the ability to harness the economic potential of the renewable energy revolution over onshore wind farm subsidy, contracts for difference, contract conditionality and energy taxation, they all lie with Westminster. And the Cabinet Secretary has outlined the implications of the management of these powers at UK level for Scottish manufacturers, and in so doing schooled Dean Lockhart on these matters. I share Stuart McMillan's frustration at the Tory speeches. He might be disappointed. I'm just completely bored of it, and I am in a position, same generation as Stuart McMillan, that my parents were at the very sharp end of what the Tory government in the 1980s did to manufacturing in Clydebank. I want to pay tribute to the work of energy journalist Dick Winchester, who writes in the Energy Voice. He's long been a campaigner to get the manufacture of renewables infrastructure to be based in Scotland. And in many ways, what's happened with Bifab is a watershed moment. If things don't change, local companies will lose out time and time again as we fulfil the wind infrastructure needs of the future. Conditionality is not completely in our gift, but maybe it should be for all our sakes. As well as lamenting the missed manufacturing opportunities of the Aberdeen offshore wind farm, Dick Winchester has pointed to the development of projects such as Batwind, which involves a battery-based energy system. And that system is, the technology comes from Unicos, a German-American technology company. But he points out that there's actually companies in Caithness that could have won that. Areas across Scotland should be able to share in this potential. But heaven help us if that were left to the Tories. Now the Scottish Government's welcome and speedy commitment to reducing the emissions that have caused the climate emergency, they do provoke mixed feelings in my part of Scotland. I have to be honest about that. I'm on record in this chamber of talking of the potential economic and social implications a transition away from burning oil and gas could have to the hundreds of thousands of North East people who make their living from the exploration and production of hydrocarbons, or who are in the supply chain. This transition must be just, it must be managed, and it must be invested in. And that's both governments that have to do that. The establishment of the Just Transition Commission by the Scottish Government is of huge importance to the North East of Scotland, and I can't overstate how important it is that the very relevant skills that our people, not just in the North East but in Fife as well, are harnessed in that transition to renewables, and serious efforts are made to ensure that we transition justly and fairly. The prizes are there. There are massive opportunities, but we don't want them leaking out of Scotland. Presiding Officer, I've got very short.
Mark Rachael. Giving way, I share the importance of the Just Transition Commission with you. Do you think it's important then that it's put on a statutory basis to stop the Tories decommissioning it and getting rid of it if they ever come into government in Scotland? Gillian Martin.
Well, Mark Rachael actually knows my feelings on this because obviously I sit in the committee alongside him. I'm not completely convinced it would make much difference. I'd like Government to be held account for what happens in the Just Transition Commission. Presiding Officer, before I sit down, I'd also gently suggest to Labour that they be mindful of this as well. The Aberdeen wind farm was awarded £40 million euros of funding from the European Union. And with a hard Brexit on the horizon, the loss of funding like this could mean that large renewable projects like this are in jeopardy and the jobs that come with them. Let's work together to avoid that situation too. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call Alexander Stewart to be followed by John Mason. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to participate in the debate Fife Ready for Renewable campaign, which seeks to secure contract production of wind turbine parts at BIFAB. We recognise the need for more renewable energy to help us cut emissions as part of our balanced mix of energy sources. And we are clear that the central to that is ensuring the security and supply, affordability and decarbonisation. The right of the investment and the innovation at the cutting edge of technology within our renewable energy sector. We can ensure that we meet our renewable energy targets while creating jobs. And that's the vital, important part we're discussing here today, Presiding Officer. It's jobs, it's the economy, and it's the livelihood of this location in Fife that is being talked about, and other parts. So I pay tribute to the workforce for BIFAB for what they've done in supporting that economy across Fife and other regions. When we are seeking to tackle climate change, it does seem rather ironic to build many of the parts of a renewable energy source, like an offshore wind farm, halfway around the world and then transport it back to Fife. That makes no sense to anybody. And we've heard from many speakers today about that nonsensical situation that we're finding ourselves in. And transport emissions have remained high and were up to 1/3 overall back in 2016. When we have a company like BIFAB here in Scotland that has the capability and has the capacity to build parts of wind turbines while supporting local jobs and supporting local community, it is completely mad for us to even consider having that take place on a wind farm that will be located just 10 miles off the coast of Fife. As we have heard today, some fears are without this contract that the survival of the area and the associated jobs in and around the location will be lost. To that end, we support the calls for BIFAB to be awarded the contract for the wind turbine parts, and they will be built closer. And it's important that we encourage the EDF renewables and have discussions with both governments, the UK government and the Scottish government, to consider the stability to ensure that offshore wind farm in Scotland is practical, is possible and is encouraged. And it is encouraging to see that the campaign that's been built up includes community groups. It includes the workforce. It has elected representatives across the council, across the parliament and across parliaments other places, and environmentals as well. But I also pay tribute to the trade unions who've worked together to put on this pressure, and they have made a massive impact. And we have to acknowledge that because we've worked alongside them, all of us, to try and ensure that that takes place. And pressure must be put on to EDF Renewables to make sure that they consider going forward. The Scottish Government has a role in this campaign, and we've heard today from the Cabinet Secretary that that role is being taken seriously, and rightly it should be. But we also have a stake in BIFAB. The Scottish Government put a stake in BIFAB, so the taxpayer has a stake in BIFAB. And it's important that we acknowledge that and we recognise that. So the Scottish Government has an obligation to ensure that BIFAB can be secured. And we have an obligation as politicians to do all we can. And I say that includes having discussions with UK ministers and the UK Government about what can take place to ensure that happens. It would also be naive of us to think that this debate is just about one single firm, Presiding Officer, because it's not. There is a wider economic environment, and that is being presided across by the government here in Holyrood. And we've already heard today about the difficulties and the decline that's taken place in some locations and some parts, and that has caused continual disruption across many sectors. Our growth is forecast to be slower than other parts of the UK up until 2023, and we already have the lowest within the European Union. And over the last decade, we've heard and seen that job growth and the regions across the UK, and we have the smallest job growth in the UK. There have been some worrying trends and some worrying economies for the Scottish Government, and in particular, the Government have failed in the past to to ensure that we had the renewable. No, I want to make some progress. Back in 2010, the then First Minister claimed that the offshore renewable industry would create 20,000 jobs in Scotland over the course of the following 10 years, but that did not materialise. They have also claimed to support renewable energy, but we have seen some companies that, for example, went into administration because the Scottish Government removed all the public funding back in 2014. And we've also heard from situations and companies that had to see their workforce reduced. So we all have to acknowledge that not everybody is getting this right. So there are faults on both sides, and we need to work for the communities we represent and everyone who's working together. The UK government is committed to going further, and we have seen the offshore wind sector deal, which is bringing 250 million into the situation. And that deal will forecast for us to quadruple the number of jobs in the sector and increase the global by fivefold. So, Presiding Officer, we have and we will continue to support, and we in the Scottish Conservatives support the efforts that have taken place within our energy mix to ensure that our economy. Offshore wind farms are a vital component. So, in conclusion, when trying to reduce emissions and quite simply does not make sense for, as I've said, commissioning parts of wind farm developments from halfway around the world. And therefore, it's up to all of us to support BIFAB to ensure that the yards, the jobs and the communities which they depend on are looked after. And as I say, I pay tribute to the GMB and Unite Unions for all they've done, and we must do all we can to support and secure Fife and its economy. And that is both the UK Government and the Scottish Government playing their part. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call John Mason before we move to closing speeches. John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I would add my voice to the many we've already had, supporting specifically BIFAB, but also local businesses in general to get as much work as they possibly can. I agree with a number of the things that Richard Leonard said in his speech, talking about the failure to plan by the various owners over the years of the BIFAB facility, and suggesting, as I agree with, that profit has been so much of a driving factor rather than the common good. I would also agree with a number of the points that Derek Mackay made, encouraging that the government is exploring powers, for example, using the Crown Estate, which we now have some control over, and that if there are to be Scottish guarantees in the future, then there absolutely must be benefits to the local economy. But as he said, it is the UK Government that has more levers of the power, for example, in relation to CFD. The Economy Committee, of which I am Vice-Convener, had a roundtable on BIFAB on the 23rd of April, and there certainly were strong suggestions at that meeting that some overseas operators are effectively being allowed to run at a loss every single year, potentially with 35% of their turnover being in the form of a loss, according to the claims that were made. And so obviously, if that is the case, it's not surprising that our businesses are unable to compete, and certainly that is state aid by my understanding of the term. Now, it has been suggested that if other countries can bend the rules, then so should we. And I agree that we should not be naive or particularly legalistic in our approach if other people are perhaps ignoring some of the rules or at least interpreting them in a more relaxed fashion. However, I would also argue that the rules are there for a good reason, and the best solution is surely that everyone does follow the rules, and that the EU, or whoever it is, should be ensuring that there is conformity to them. As Scottish Renewables said in their briefing for today's debate, quote, "The procurement processes are tightly governed by UK and European legislation and are focused on providing the best possible value for money for Scottish and UK energy consumers." End of quote. Now, I did ask at committee if it was not the role partly of Scottish enterprise to follow up and potentially complain if state aid rules were being broken in other countries. And I have to say the answer I got back on that particular day did seem to be a bit on the vague side. DF Barnes, who were represented at the round table, made the point that in countries like Canada there are penalties, and if local benefits are not delivered as promised, then somebody has to pay for that. However, in this country there does seem to be very little comeback if local organisations and individuals do not get the benefits they were promised. And that's where I would point out on some of the things I was a bit disappointed, particularly on Dean Lockhart's comments, that he said, if I got him correctly, that the UK government should, quote, encourage EDF. And I have to say that, and then he was intervened on, I think, by the Cabinet Secretary, and again he avoided that there should be a commitment and that the UK government should force a commitment. So that is somewhat disappointing. I think Willie Rennie agreed that there should be binding conditions when I intervened on him, although Claire Baker suggested urging EDF. And again, I would say we want to do a little bit more than just urging EDF if we have the power. I thought Alec Neil's points, many of them were very good, but he did make it very clear that we just do not have the power at the moment to impose any of these conditions. The EU regulations are there to protect decent businesses from unfair competition and to protect taxpayers from paying over the odds for contracts for someone else's cronies. We can all think of times in the past when both in this country and in other countries contracts were wrongly awarded, not because it was the cheapest price or even best value, but because there was an unhealthy close link between those awarding and those being awarded the contracts. So whatever happens with Brexit, we must not throw the baby out with the bathwater and go back to these times. We need to get a right balance between fair competition and value for money on the one hand, but absolutely supporting local businesses and jobs on the other. And the points that Lewis MacDonald made are relevant there, that the workforce pay and conditions in other countries have to be a factor in that. We also need to focus, as I think we are agreed on, as what we are best at. It's been often said that we cannot compete in mass producing the cheapest products, be that food or engineering products or anything else. But we can compete at the top end, and that's what we believe BiFab and others can do, with the best innovation and the most specialised high-quality products. Again, in Scottish Renewables briefing, they give the specific example of CS Wind in Campbellton, where a £27 million investment in 2016 has upskilled the workforce and the equipment. They now have the ability to produce best-in-class turbine towers for the UK and Europe and have doubled their productivity between 2017 and 2018. I was disappointed in some of the things Bill Bowman said. He failed to suggest, when intervened on, what steps the Scottish Government could or should have taken to do more in all of this. And I would suggest that it is his party's commitment to unrestricted free market that has caused a lot of these current problems. And so, for example, Scottish Power was privatised, which could have been a state-owned player in this whole question. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, there's a lot of agreement today. Hopefully we will stay in the EU and be part of the single market. But perhaps we need to look more closely at what our competitor countries are doing and either challenge their behaviour or learn from what they are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll move now to closing speeches. I call on Jamie Halker-Johnson to wind up for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. From across the Chamber, it's clear that the level of involvement or lack of involvement of Scotland's businesses in Scotland's renewable supply chain is a matter of real concern and anger. As we've seen in today's debate, the issues faced by BiFab are set within a wider context of problems with how we support the energy sector, problems that go beyond those detailed in Labour's motion. As Scotland's onshore wind sector grew, with significant support from the public sector, it became clear that much of the work was not falling to businesses here at home. And people are rightly concerned that we risk seeing the same thing happening again in relation to offshore. So as we look to the future, the worry is quite clear, that Scotland serves as a base for renewables, that it is Scottish research that makes great strides in developing the energy technologies of the future, but that the businesses here simply do not benefit as they should. Now, it would be foolish to ignore that we operate in a global marketplace. Competition is healthy, it helps drive down the wholesale cost of energy and provides benefits that can carry over to the consumer. But when major projects are taking place in our own backyard, people will quite reasonably ask why much of it, the manufacturing work and the jobs that are created, are overseas. We've heard of the expertise that exists here in Scotland. I'd like to just make some progress, if you will. Much of the legacy of our oil and gas industry, an industry which has been reasonably successful in creating skills, jobs and industry in several parts of the country. And it appears that we can all find agreement that Scottish business should be able to win these contracts, build up local supply chains, create jobs and provide benefit to their communities. Yet it seems, despite assurances, that yards are lying empty while work begins elsewhere. While this is not a committee debate, the work of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee is significant in relation to today's discussion. Other speakers have touched on some of our activities, but I think it's important to reflect on what the committee has done to bring together representatives from across the sector. Meeting with them, we heard a number of issues. There was confusion over the application of state aid rules in the industry. The businesses felt that some competitors were not compliant with the rules as they understood them, and it seems as enterprise agencies understood them. Where additional support is being given elsewhere, an unlevel playing field, as the Cabinet Secretary rightly called it, risks being created with undue commercial advantage. Equally, while panellists acknowledged that there was a responsibility to challenge breaches, there did not seem to be a great deal of clarity over how and who. The committee was also provided with a written update from the Cabinet Secretary on the supply chain and fabrication work identified by the Scottish Government following the offshore wind summit at the beginning of the month. This is welcome, particularly the need for a collaborative approach by the Scottish Government and the UK Government, as both the Cabinet Secretary and Dean Lockhart mentioned. But these commitments must be matched with detail and action. And while specific problems exist within BIFAB, the Scottish Government's approach to supporting business clearly has a far wider impact on our economy. It is not only in renewables that we are seeing skills and capacity go to waste, but it is in the renewable sector that we are seeing these opportunities to build a strong domestic supply chain lost time and time again through a lack of preparation and joined-up thinking. I'll let the member who asked me first go first, if that's right.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Jamie Halcrow-Johnson for taking the intervention. Just on that particular point, surely he's got to agree that when government policy ensures that there's a vast reduction in training, such as apprenticeships, as was the case in the 1980s, then surely you're going to actually have a shortage in the workforce when the economy is going to change and there's going to be more opportunity to actually build in the manufacturing sector.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
I mean, the responsibility for apprenticeship and skills and training has been with this Parliament here since 1999. Are you suggesting that somehow... can you clarify that point? Because I don't want to kind of misrepresent you.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you once again. Very briefly, in the 1980s, when government policy changed and apprenticeships were scrapped and the youth training scheme was brought in, certainly a training scheme that was nowhere near the quality of apprenticeships, then how can you actually go and build ships? How can you go and build these jackets if there was a shortage of the workforce to actually go and do the job?
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
I'm sorry, but I think you're arguing that we lost that 40 years ago, and in that 40 years period since, somehow we've had our hands tied. I mean, that's a nonsensical position. SNP speakers today have focused on what they can't do and nothing about what they actually can do. No, I won't. No, we've heard a lot from the Cabinet Secretary speaking from a sedentary position. I'd like to get on. Well, you should be speaking from a sedentary position because I'm still standing. In his speech, my colleague Dean Lockhart noted the concerns with various stakeholders over the Nersh Nagoa project off the coast of Fife and the compelling reasons for bringing jobs and investment to his region. The economic impact would indeed be transformative. The skills are there and the environmental case is clear. And looking wider, Alexander Burnett spoke about the pressing need to support the renewable sector to combat climate change. He also rightly highlighted the need to build the skills required for the future if we're to have a successful industry in Scotland, a point heard by the Economy Committee. Looking at others, Willie Rennie and others highlighted the situation where to supply green energy machines in this country, parts of those machines are now being shipped from the other side of the world. Both Claire Baker and Alexander Stewart spoke passionately about the impact of these decisions in their area, and they talked about, I think Claire Baker talked about a visit to the site. It's a site that I visited myself many years ago with former Mid-Scotland and Fife MSP Ted Brocklebank. And it was just after, or not that long after, the Converter Yard had closed, and the impact of that was still being very much felt then. And as I said, there's been no shortage of SNP speakers today, but it was left rather to Alex Neil, and I think a little bit from John Mason, to actually talk about some ideas rather than just the limitations. Presiding officer, Scotland has the potential for billions of pounds worth of investment in renewables, stretching forward for decades to come. In my own region, we have Orkney and Shetland, looking not simply at wind energy as part of the changes around remote island wind, but also into the future with innovations in wave and tidal energy. Both communities have shown how previously the oil and gas sector can play a significant difference to our remote communities. And now communities across the Highlands and Islands stand ready to take advantage of the potential opportunities for renewables. And it is right that these communities benefit, that direct and supply chain jobs accompany renewable energy, that by taking advantage of the superb facilities across Scotland, particularly those in the Highlands and Islands, where former oil and gas yards are ready for use for manufacturing, fabrication and for servicing offshore renewables, that by taking advantage of these facilities, we can help to rebalance the central belt focus of Scotland's economy. It will be disappointing if the Scottish Government cannot work to seize these opportunities, that we see another industry based in Scotland, but not built in Scotland. If we are to lose out on future investment, sustainable jobs, and the chance to boost some of those communities in Scotland that need it most, that really will be a tragedy.
Thank you. And Colin Paul Wheelhouse to close with the Scottish Government.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been, for the most part, a valuable and timely debate highlighting the importance this Parliament places on harnessing Scotland's tremendous offshore wind resource to decarbonise our energy system in line with Scotland's energy strategy, but also the strength, clearly, the resolve across this chamber to achieve a fair share of the economic benefit of the construction and operations of offshore wind installations. My colleague Derek Mackay has outlined the routes that Scottish Ministers, Crown Estate Scotland and Marine Scotland are exploring to further support the Scottish offshore wind supply chain. I don't know whether Jamie Halker-Johnson just switched off or was out of the chamber, but he clearly has not been listening to the Cabinet Secretary's speech. I want to close by discussing the work being undertaken through our reinvigorated industry working group. Before that, though, I want to emphasise our view that the UK Government must show greater leadership in areas where powers are reserved, such as securing local content through the Contracts for Difference mechanism, which is the main route to market for offshore wind, both fixed and floating, and which is also reserved power, the power of the UK Government in this respect. The offshore wind sector deal is welcome, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. However, I would also gently point out to all the Conservative speakers that energy policy is fully reserved. It is the UK Government's role that has led to the axing of ROCs, the Renewable Obligation Certificates, the axing of Scotland's ability to set Scottish ROCs, the removal of the feed-in tariff regime, the axing of the minima promised by David Cameron for the marine energy sector, axed by Theresa May without a general election, and the recent restriction in RHI and renewable heat. So we'll take no lessons from the Conservatives on this part of the House about the support for the renewable energy sector. And Mr Burnett talked of the inaction, but I will not take intervention from the Conservatives. You refuse to take an intervention from me, Mr Lockhart, so please sit down. Mr Burnett talked of inaction, but Scotland has generated in 2018 the equivalent of 74.6% of our electricity from renewables, while the UK has generated less than 30%. So who is showing leadership on renewables, Mr Lockhart, Mr Burnett? And of course, as John Mason highlighted, and Bill Bowman was not able to identify one clear step we could take to have done more to secure procurement of Scottish supply chain in the powers we had prior to Crown Estate being devolved. And the Cabinet Secretary has already outlined we are now using these powers to our advantage. We are ensuring the Scottish industry is able to take full advantage of the opportunity presented by the sector deal through restructuring what was previously known as the Offshore Wind Industry Group to create a more strategically focused Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, which I now co-chair alongside Brian McFarlane of SSE. That group provides a forum for representatives from all areas of the sector to lead key work streams, and this will ensure the work of SOEC is aligned to the deal itself and to ensure Scotland's strong existing and potential supply chain offering is recognised. The supply chain element of SOEC will champion the two Scottish supply chain clusters and explore ways of strengthening and expanding our supply chain to increase local content in future offshore wind projects. While SOEC is largely shaped around the sector deal ambitions, it can of course also react to any other industry issues as and when they arise. Conservative members seem to have taken a total disconnect from the process of the CFD. The CFD support mechanism run by the UK Government, I remind them of that, theoretically offers significant opportunities for our talented workforce and supply chain companies, such as at BiFab, CS Wind, which we've heard about, Global Energy Group in NIG and others, with 3 Scottish offshore projects due to bid into the imminent CFD round. UK ministers have created a policy environment, though, through CFD that encourages rapid cost reduction, which may be welcome, but the commercial risk has been pushed down into the lower tiers of the supply chain, with no measures to protect those SMEs worst affected. Scotland has a pipeline of over 4 gigawatts of offshore wind consented in our waters, with further licensing opportunities being considered by Crown Estate Scotland. However, by focusing so clearly on price alone, we believe UK ministers are failing the wider economic interest with CFD. It's absolutely vital that UK ministers utilise the powers that they have to ensure greater weight is given than at present to supply chain plans that they collect as part of the process when allocating CFD contracts, and attach conditionality, as the Cabinet Secretary and others have said. At present, maximum weight is placed on the price per megawatt hour, which has reached a low of £57.50 per megawatt hour, at a time when far more generous funding of £92.50 has been provided as a strike price for new nuclear power in Somerset. There is a clear inconsistency in how UK ministers approach technologies, and far greater emphasis on the total value added to the UK economy could be achieved if supply chain plans were reflected and conditionality attached as part of rebalancing between price per megawatt hour and the quality of the bids that are received. As we've heard, the sector deal launched by UK ministers sets an industry-agreed 60% UK content target by 2030, a key finding of Martin Whitmarsh's supply chain review. While we welcome the sector deal, we recognise it will take significant collaborative effort from industry and governments to ensure its results in meaningful improvement. However, it's absolutely essential that developers uphold their commitment under the sector deal to deliver target levels of local content, and we expect to see substantial increases, particularly in the capital expenditure phase of these projects. Supply chain investment under the aligned offshore wind growth partnership is welcome, but insufficient in of itself to achieve what we need to achieve. However, and the Tories should listen to this also, the review also recommended UK ministers should deliver twice the quantum of financial support for offshore wind, with visibility of auctions out to 2030. And given more recent committee and climate change advice to the effect that the UK now needs up to 75 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050, I will not, Mr Lockhart. Supporting the supply chain now could net the Scottish and UK economies a far greater return over the longer term. Regrettably, BEIS have applied a mere 6 gigawatt cap to the next CFD auction, making it unlikely that the full £60 million budget will be accessible to industry. And I would also say to the Tories, more investment now can mitigate the impact of anticipated slippage in the delivery of Hinkley C. Without the CFD mechanism delivering a strong and visible pipeline of work at the necessary volume, the offshore wind supply chain will struggle to maintain momentum and increase competitiveness, and that would be a missed opportunity to deploy and develop a supply chain that can compete globally. The UK Government controls that pipeline. I hope we've made clear today there is a role for the Scottish Government, but there is also a role for the UK Government, and the Scottish Government is using all the levers at our disposal to support this important sector, and we will ensure platforms such as the Supply Chain Summit that the Cabinet Secretary chaired and SOEC deliver the fundamental changes required to strengthen our supply chain and secure the just transition that we are all wanting to seek. However, importantly, UK ministers should take the action necessary to address the weaknesses in the CFD process, review the process, and I hope we can unite in that today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. And now I call on Claudia Beamish to close the debate and wind up for the Labour Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The swell in support for climate change action lately has been heartening. I welcome the Scottish Government shifting to the responsible net zero target for the Climate Change Bill. It is exciting to see the growing acceptance from all parties for the need to justify any policy in any portfolio against the climate imperative. I pay respect to the school strikers and young people across the world who are driving forward the public backing for this work and further focusing the minds of politicians. It is a climate and environment emergency, and that message is getting through. But Scottish Labour cannot emphasise enough that a just transition must be the ultimate driver. Scotland's pathway to the net zero economy must be paved by the Labour movement, safeguarding workers and communities and securing the real new opportunities for the benefit of our new economy across all sectors. My party is clear on these terms. That is why it has been a year since Scottish Labour set a net zero greenhouse gas emissions target, which the SNP at that point refused. And inextricably linked, it has also been a year since we were calling for a statutory Just Transition Commission to serve us well into the future. The Just Transition Partnership, formed by Friends of the Earth and the Scottish Trade Union Congress and joined by others, has worked tirelessly to push this message and to make sure that we design industrial policies to this effect. But the Scottish Government somehow remains unclear as to the need, despite considering the merit of a commission being on the face of the Climate Change Bill. The current lifespan and footing of the Commission fundamentally misunderstands the concerns of workers and the requirements for a resilient future economy. I was relieved when the Government agreed to consider a statutory commission, but as stage 2 of the climate bill draws closer, I am concerned that that concession might be wavering and waning. Workers and communities must not be thrown to the wind. A short-term arrangement can only be a short-term strategy setter and is not fit for purpose. We need vision and direction setting for the long term, and all future governments need to be held to account until we reach net zero emissions across all sectors. And we need clever policy design and support mechanisms so that we come out to the other side with a fairer society. Scottish Labour supports Fife Ready for Renewal campaign by the GMB and Unite, supported by the STUC, and this Parliament is, as we've heard today, united in backing them. Along with Richard Leonard and other Labour MSPs and those from other parties, I met with the unions today, shop stewards from Unite and GMB and the STUC. The workforce stands ready and determined to work on this contract. Claire Baker, who has worked closely with the Fife Yards over the years, has made clear the importance of jobs for Fife and that promises must be delivered, and I welcome her analysis today. So, here is a test for the Scottish Government. It is also a test for us all across this chamber.
Ms. Muir, can I just ask you one second? Could I just ask members, there's a lot of quite quiet conversations going on, but cumulatively the effect is very noisy. Could I just ask you to keep the conversations to a minimum? Ms. Beamish.
Thank you. As we have heard time and again in this debate, a Scottish Yard sits ready and waiting. It has the skills, it has the facilities, it has the labour, and crucially, it holds the opportunity to kick-start a decent manufacturing work in the clean energy economy, where so many jobs have already slipped through our fingers. As Lewis MacDonald said, what are the working conditions in Indonesia? Cabinet Secretary, we have a fragile promise to consider a statutory just transition commission. We have had votes in favour of a Green New Deal, but no further information. We have been assured that the Scottish National Investment Bank will have a green investment focus, but will that bill deliver? And the First Minister assured the Chamber that she supports the BIFAB yard and its workforce. But the workforce has feared redundancy for years and contracts have been missed time and again. When exactly does the Scottish Government expect our manufacturing base to begin to flourish and Scotland's green energy revolution to take off? When will this pattern of offshore jobs end? If not now, with a capable company that this government is a substantial shareholder in. As Richard Leonard stated, the green revolution must mean an interventionist state acting on behalf of the people and our industrial communities. The STUC Broken Promises and Offshore Jobs report found that the past promises for jobs in the low-carbon and renewable energy economy have not been realised because we haven't developed a Scottish supply chain producing domestic content. Alec Rowley stressed that the unions simply say that they want a level playing field. Yes, very briefly.
Cabinet Secretary Dermot Mackay.
In all the stakeholders and trade unions I've engaged with, some of those are not the issues they've addressed with me. It's others who have chosen to put cost before conditionality of supply chain content coming from Scotland. That needs to change, first of all, from the UK Government, but the further actions that I've revealed today, will the Labour Party support me in taking them forward?
Right,
Crown Estate and Marine Scotland, and that will create the culture of expectation for work to come to Scotland.
Claudia Beamish.
In the case of the NNG offshore wind farm, and more broadly, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that those community and environmental externalities, which we all know about, need to be factored into procurement processes in order to ensure that Scottish workers and communities benefit from the green revolution? As Richard Leonard stressed, we have millions of pounds of public expenditure through subsidies and through levies invested in renewable energy to harness a natural resource with no public accountability and little economic benefit. Alex Neil is right that everything should be reviewed from planning to finance. And the Cabinet Secretary is right that it is important that we don't let the developers off the hook. I welcome the commitment on the Crown Estate licences, if belated. Surely this could have been written into the Act. I also welcome the decommissioning arrangements highlighted. But Scottish Government expectations in relation to the supply chains is not enough. This is public money and support must not be given if the work is is not to be done here in Scotland. The review of contracts for difference must be robust and respect the necessity of investment in Scottish yards. And I note the Tory recognition of this need. Paul Wheelhouse has, however, stressed that the price alone cannot be the criteria. Inconsistency cannot go on. The quality of the bid must be taken into account. Lewis MacDonald stressed that EDF, and by implication other companies in the sector, like to have the political support when it suits them, but now they need to do their bit. And more broadly, he emphasised how important it is for compromise for companies moving away from oil and gas into offshore renewables, that they deserve government support, and that the renewable sector and EDF is certainly part of this. Both governments need to develop a consenting strategy to tie licensing to UK and Scottish content. And more broadly again, is the Cabinet Secretary able to ensure, with his colleague John Swinney, that the right skills, both initial and transferable, are being identified so workers are ready here in Scotland for the green jobs which are here and are coming? Scottish Labour is committed to working with the UK Labour government when we reach power to create 50,000 green jobs, and 15,000 of these could be, and I stress could be, in offshore wind. This will be supported by our Scottish Labour industrial strategy in Scotland, and we will make sure that this is driven not by the market, but by an innovative state, as Richard Leonard has stressed. Changing position on air departure tax was the right thing to do. That policy was calculated to have the equivalent of 30,000 new cars on the road, and yet EDF's plans to manufacture and then ship from Indonesia is said to have the equivalent of 35 million cars on the road. The company should be ashamed. Scotland will not hide away from our international responsibility. We are now working together across this chamber to make sure that we reach the ambitious global targets of limiting temperature rise to 1.5. These commitments are right and in line with the principles of justice for future generations and for the global south. But the principle of just transition absolutely cannot be left behind in this climate zeitgeist. It's time to support the industries of our future and the workers and communities of today. This must start with the BIFAB contract. Together, we can do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes this afternoon's debate, Build Them at BIFAB. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 17431 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on Graham Day to move the motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no one has asked to speak on or against the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 17431 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. So we turn to decision time. The first question is that Amendment 17425.3 in the name of Derek Mackay, which seeks to amend motion 17425 in the name of Richard Leonard on Build Them at BIFAB be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next question is that Amendment 17425.2 in the name of Dean Lockhart, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Richard Leonard be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the final question is that motion 17425 in the name of Richard Leonard as amended on Build Them at BIFAB be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Mark Ruskell on
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK Government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.